Jessica Lane maneuvered her beloved car along the familiar curves of the country road, the engine humming softly beneath her steady hands. The evening air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, carried on a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves overhead. Golden streaks of sunlight pierced through the dense canopy, casting fleeting patterns across the windshield. For once, the weight of her badge felt lighter. The burden of her role as sheriff momentarily lifted. She exhaled slowly, savoring the rare calm that wrapped around her like a warm blanket. No one could have foreseen that within mere minutes, this serenity would shatter, thrusting her into a battle not just for survival, but for something far darker, a fight that would test the very core of who she was. As the first black woman to claim the title of sheriff in this tight-knit town, Jessica's journey had been anything but easy. Years of grit, unshakable courage, and countless clashes with prejudice had carved her path to this position. She'd faced down sneers and whispers, weathered the skeptical glares of colleagues who doubted her, and endured the unspoken doubts of a community slow to trust. Each day in uniform was a dual mission: to safeguard the people she'd sworn to protect, and to prove to herself as much as to others that she belonged. Respect had come, eventually, but it was hard-won, forged through relentless effort and a resilience that refused to bend under pressure. Tonight, though, driving home after a stretch of uneventful days, she allowed herself a fleeting taste of peace. The quiet road stretched out before her, a ribbon of asphalt flanked by towering trees, and for a moment, the scrutiny, the tension, the ever-present hum of danger faded into the background. That tranquility exploded in an instant. A distant roar tore through the stillness, growing louder, more menacing with each passing second. Headlights blazed into view, blindingly bright. As a vehicle barreled toward her at a reckless speed, Jessica's pulse spiked, her hands tightening on the wheel. She yanked it hard to the right, tires shrieking against the pavement as she swerved just in time. The world tilted, her car shuddered, gravel crunching beneath the wheels as she wrestled it to the roadside. Her chest heaved, breath ragged, heart hammering against her ribs. Time hung suspended, the echo of screeching tires ringing in her ears. The peace she'd clung to moments ago dissolved, replaced by a gnawing unease that coiled tight in her gut. A storm was brewing, she could feel it. Shaken but steadying herself, Jessica inhaled deeply, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. A figure emerged from the twilight shadows ahead, a tall, middle-aged man with a weathered face etched with stern lines. He moved toward her car with measured steps, his boots scuffing softly against the gravel. His presence was unexpected, almost ghostly in the fading light. Stopping a respectful distance away, he studied her with eyes that brimmed with quiet concern. Though his lips remained pressed in a tight line, he didn't speak, didn't intrude, just stood there, a silent sentinel assessing her safety. Their gazes locked for a heart-beaten, unspoken exchange. Heavy with something Jessica couldn't quite name before, he turned and melted back into the dusk, vanishing as swiftly as he'd appeared. She watched him go, her brow furrowing, a flicker of curiosity mingling with unease. Who was he? A random witness, or something more? The encounter lingered in her mind, a puzzle piece that didn't fit, stirring a premonition she couldn't shake. The near collision still pulsed through her veins, but Jessica's instinction by years in law enforcement refused to let it slide. Reckless driving like that wasn't just a fluke, it was a threat. She restarted her engine, the low growl of the car steadying her nerves, and eased back onto the road, her eyes locked on the taillights of the offending vehicle, now a dim red glow in the distance. Determination hardened her jaw as she followed, keeping a cautious distance along the winding, deserted stretch. The night deepened around her, the trees looming like silent witnesses. When the other car finally slowed and pulled over, dust swirling in its wake, Jessica felt a surge of resolve. This was her moment to confront whoever had ripped apart her evening's calm. She parked carefully behind them, her hand closing around the radio, fingers brushing the cool metal as she prepared to call for backup if needed. Stepping out, she straightened her shoulders, her boots crunching against the gravel with deliberate purpose. The air was cooler now, sharp against her skin, but her demeanor remained unshaken, calm yet unyielding. Two figures emerged from the vehicle ahead, their silhouettes sharpening into familiarity as they stepped into the faint glow of her headlights. Her stomach tightened. She knew theme officers from her own station, faces she'd glimpsed in passing, men she'd never had cause to engage deeply. Relief flickered briefly in her chest. They were colleagues, after all. But that warmth evaporated as she caught the glint in their ice-cold, defiant, laced with something uglier. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with a rough-hewn face and an arrogant tilt to his chin, sized her up with a smirk that twisted his features into a mask of disdain. "Well, look who we've got here," he drawled, his voice thick with sarcasm, each word a jab. "A lady sheriff, huh? Shouldn't you be home tucking your kids into bed instead of playing cop out here?" His laugh was bitter, a jagged sound that grated against the night. Jessica held her ground, her expression steady as she introduced herself formally. Sheriff Jessica Linney, and explained why she'd trailed them. "Dangerous driving demanded accountability," she said, her tone even but firm. The second officer, a weary man with a steely gaze and a face carved from granite, cut her off before she could finish. "Sheriff," he scoffed, his voice dripping with mockery. "Do you even know who you're talking to? Don't kid yourself, you've got no pull here. This is a man's job, not yours." Heat surged through Jessica's veins, a wildfire of anger she fought to contain. She clenched her fists at her sides, forcing her breathing to slow. She'd faced this before with Barb's, the belittling, the assumption she didn't belong. But this was different. These weren't just words, they were a challenge, a gauntlet thrown at her feet. She pressed on, demanding an explanation for their actions, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The driver chuckled again, low and menacing. "We don't need a lecture from you, Sheriff. Step aside before you stir up trouble you can't handle." His eyes glittered with contempt, daring her to push further. Jessica stood tall, staring into those hostile gazes, her mind racing. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding, it was a crack in the foundation of everything she'd worked for. Justice wasn't just a word to her, it was a vow etched into every step of her career. But here, in the shadows of this quiet road, she glimpsed something deeper, a rot within her own ranks, a defiance that mocked the very laws she upheld. Before she could respond, a burst of static crackled from her radio, sharp and jarring in the stillness, a voice faint, trembling. Anna Mouse spilled through the interference. "Sheriff Lane, watch yourself with those two. They've got a history of twisting their power, but no one dares call them out. They silence anyone who tries." The transmission died as abruptly as it began, leaving a chill that sank into her bones. Her pulse quickened, suspicion blooming alongside a fierce determination. This wasn't just about tonight, it was a thread in a larger tapestry of corruption she'd sworn to unravel. She stepped back, swallowing her fury, her mind already mapping out her next move. She wouldn't let this slide, not the disrespect, not the threat, not the betrayal of their shared oath. As she retreated to her car, the weight of her duty settled heavier than ever. This moment could redefine everything, not just for her, but for the town she served. Justice demanded action, and she'd see it through, no matter the cost. But the confrontation wasn't over. The two officers advanced, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the gravel. The driver loomed over her, his hulking frame radiating hostility, his sneer a weapon aimed to wound. "You think you've got any say here?" He spat, his voice a venomous hiss. "You're just a little black woman playing at being sheriff." The words hit like a physical blow. But Jessica steeled herself, reminding herself of her rank, her purpose. She met his gaze, her voice steady despite the storm raging within. "You're abusing your authority and breaking the law. I won't ignore that." Her defiance ignited their rage. The second officer lunged forward, his face a mask of fury, and shoved her with a force that sent her stumbling. She hit the ground hard, the rough earth biting into her palms, her head spinning from the impact. Pain flared, but she gritted her teeth, pushing herself up. Before she could fully rise, the driver stepped in, his boots slamming into her leg with a sickening thud. She crumpled again, the air rushing from her lungs. "Who do you think you are, preaching to us?" he snarled, his voice a vicious growl. "This ain't no place for a black woman to act all high and mighty. Know your place." The pain throbbed through her, a sharp reminder of the stakes, but it was the anger deep, searing fury that burned brighter. This wasn't just an attack on her body, it was an assault on everything she stood for. Racism, power unchecked, Justice trampled underfoot, faced it all before, but never like this. Never so raw and unmasked. She dragged herself upright, her breath ragged, and fixed them with a glare that carried the weight of her resolve. "You're not just shaming me," she said, her voice low and unwavering. "You're spitting on the justice you swore to protect. I won't let this stand." The second officer laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed in the night. "You think anyone's gonna back you up? This town, these laws, they don't bend for you." His words hung heavy, a taunt meant to break her. But Jessica's spirit didn't waver. She saw it clearly now, the consequences of power wielded without restraint. The erosion of trust when those meant to uphold the law became its destroyers. This wasn't just her fight, it was a reckoning for every soul in this town who deserved better. As she limped back to her car, her body aching, but her will unbroken, she made a silent promise. She'd expose the truth, no matter how deep the corruption ran, no matter how fierce the resistance. Justice wasn't negotiable, and neither was she. In the stillness of a moonless night, Jessica stood defenseless, her breath ragged as two men towered over her with menacing intent. Without a word, without even a flicker of hesitation, they descended upon her like vultures, their fists crashing against her body with relentless fury. Each punch landed with a sickening thud, each kick drove her closer to the cold, unforgiving earth. Pain seared through her muscles, and humiliation gnawed at her spirit as she crumpled to the ground, her knees scraping against the rough dirt. Her strength ebbed away, draining like water through cracked hands, yet deep within her chest, a stubborn ember of resolve refused to flicker out. Even as her body screamed in agony, Jessica clung to the fragments of her dignity, her mind racing with defiance. She would not let them break her net entirely. The two officers finally stepped back, their breaths heavy with exertion, their eyes glinting with a cruel, victorious satisfaction. Jessica, sprawled in the dirt, felt the weight of their stare-scold, detached and utterly devoid of humanity. To them, she wasn't a person, she was a trophy, a conquest to feed their insatiable hunger for dominance. The realization hit her like a second wave of blows. These weren't just men who disrespected her, they were predators, ruthless and unyielding, ready to crush anyone who dared stand in the path of their unchecked authority. Her chest tightened with a mix of fear and disgust, but beneath it, a quiet fury began to simmer. The first officer, a hulking figure with a sneer permanently etched into his face, cast a glance toward her car parked a short distance away. His eyes gleamed with a twisted, heartless spark, as if a vicious idea had just unfurled in his mind. With deliberate, predatory steps, he strode toward the vehicle, his boots crunching against the gravel in a rhythm that sent chills racing down Jessica's spine. She watched, helpless, as he popped open the trunk and retrieved a small gas cannon she always kept tucked away for emergencies during her long drives through the desolate countryside. Her heart pounded as she understood his intent, and with a surge of desperation, she summoned the last scraps of her strength. "Please," she croaked, her voice trembling, fragile as a thread about to snap. "Don't do this." But her plea only deepened the cold curve of his smile, a smile that thrived on her fear, a smile that promised no mercy. He ignored her, tipping the can with a slow, almost theatrical flourish. Gasoline splashed onto the ground around her car, each drop hitting the pavement with a faint, ominous plop. To Jessica, those sounds were deafening, reverberating through her like the tolling of a death knell. When he struck the lighter, a tiny flame danced to life in his hand, and in that moment, the world seemed to fracture. Jessica lunged forward, her body protesting with every movement, her legs trembling beneath her weight. She wanted to stop him, to claw the lighter from his grasp, but exhaustion pinned her down like chains. Before she could reach him, her car erupted into a roaring inferno, flames leaping into the night sky, casting an eerie glow across the empty park. The heat stung her face, and the acrid smell of burning metal filled her lungs as she watched. Paralyzed, that car wasn't just steel and rubber, it was a piece of her soul, a testament to her grit and endurance. She'd scrimped and saved for years to buy it, pouring her sweat into every payment, every repair. It had carried her through late-night patrols as sheriff, through storms and breakdowns, through moments of triumph and despair. Now it blazed before her, a pyre consuming her past, her pride, her relentless struggle. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and unchecked, but they weren't born of the physical pain coursing through her battered body. The anguish in her mind cut deeper: humiliation, degradation, the sickening realization that these men didn't just want to hurt her. They wanted to erase her, to snuff out every spark of her spirit and leave nothing but ashes. Yet, as she lay there, broken and surrounded by the crackling blaze, something shifted within her. Amid the wreckage of her resolve, a new fire ignited, not one of fleeting anger, but a steady, unyielding determination. She saw it clearly now. If she let this injustice fade into the shadows, if she allowed these men to walk away unscathed, others would suffer. Their cruelty would spread like a plague, crushing the weak, the defiant, the innocent. With no one to stand in their way, Jessica's tears slowed, her jaw tightening as she made a silent vow. This wouldn't be the end of her story. She wouldn't let their abuse of power stand unchallenged. The charred husk of her car would sear itself into her memory net just as a wound, but as a rallying cry. She would rise from this nightmare, expose their corruption, and drag them into the light of justice, no matter how long it took, no matter how fiercely they fought back. With that promise burning in her heart, Jessica forced herself to her feet and began limping along the dark, winding country road. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the chilly breeze and the distant crackle of her dying car. Each step sent jolts of pain through her bruised limbs, her wounds throbbing in rhythm with her pulse. But the fire within her burned brighter than the agony. The violence she'd endured wasn't just a personal attack, it was an assault on everything she'd built, every value she'd sworn to protect as sheriff. Tonight, her journey home wasn't a retreat, it was the first march in a war for justice. The night stretched on, vast and lonely, the shadows swallowing the road ahead. Jessica's mind churned with memories of the skepticism she'd faced as a woman clawing her way to sheriff, of the prejudice she'd shattered with every case she closed. But never had she felt so utterly violated, so stripped of her humanity. Those officers hadn't just torched her car, they'd torched the symbol of her resilience, forged through years of sacrifice. Still, she pressed forward, her boots scuffing against the dirt, her breath fogging in the cold air. She thought of the town she loved, the people she'd sworn to shield, and the weight of her duty settled over her like armor. This fight wasn't about her pride anymore, it was about safeguarding a community from the rot of corruption. Just as her strength began to falter, faint beams of light pierced the darkness ahead. A group of townsfolk emerged, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies in the night. As they drew closer, Jessica recognized their face, people she'd stood by in their own moments of need. Mrs. Carol, a widow she'd once saved from a scam, hurried forward, her eyes wide with concern beneath her graying curls. "Jessica, what happened? Who did this to you?" she asked, her voice trembling as she grasped Jessica's hand. The sheriff tried to muster a reassuring smile, but her lips quivered, and her eyes betrayed the depth of her pain. "It was a rough night," she murmured, her voice faint but laced with steel. "But I'll be all right. I won't let it end here." The others gathered around, their faces etched with worry and quiet fury. Mr. Ben, an older man with a weathered face, stepped forward. Jessica had once tracked down the thief who'd robbed his store, earning his trust in the process. Now, he placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his grip firm despite his years. "Jessica, we believe in you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't have to carry this alone. We'll stand with you." His words struck her like a lifeline, pulling her from the abyss of despair. She looked around at the small crowd. Mark, a young man she'd once counseled after a brush with the law, nodded with fierce admiration. "You told me justice can't fade, Sheriff," he said. "You've helped us all. Now it's our turn." One by one, they took her arms, supporting her weight as they walked. Their encouragement washed over her soft words, resolute promise renewing her battered spirit. The loneliness that had cloaked her began to lift, replaced by a profound gratitude. These weren't just neighbors, they were her people, bound to her by trust and shared struggles. They didn't need the full tale of her ordeal, they knew her heart, knew she'd always fought for what was right. Now, they offered their strength in return, their flashlights cutting through the dark like beacons of hope. As the town's lights twinkled in the distance, Jessica felt warmth seep into her aching bones. She pictured the streets she'd patrolled, the cafe where she'd laughed with friends, the modest home where her family waited. This was her anchor, her purpose. The night's horrors had transformed her from a woman with quiet dreams to a warrior for justice. She couldn't turn back, couldn't let the corrupt thrive in silence. Her gaze hardened, her resolve fueled by love for her town and a fierce need to protect it. The lesson was stark. Power, when twisted, devoured the innocent boot justice. When nurtured by a community, could burn brighter than any flame. With her people beside her, Jessica knew this was only the beginning. She would fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever faced the shadow of tyranny, and she wouldn't stop until the guilty answered for their sins. The air hung heavy with tension as Jessica stood at the threshold of her mission, her heart pounding with a fierce determination that refused to waver. She had always known that protecting the peace of her beloved community was no small task, yet she could never have imagined the depths of darkness she'd face. Any threat to the harmony of the town she'd sworn to shield would meet her unrelenting resolve, would not let it go unpunished. Justice wasn't just a word to her, it was a fire that burned deep within, a promise she'd made to herself and to every soul who looked to her for safety. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, shadowed by resistance and perhaps even danger from unseen forces lurking in the corners of power. But as she closed her eyes, she saw them trusting faces of the townsfolk who fueled her courage. Old Mr. J.N.'s weathered grin, gentle yet wise Mrs. Mary's stern but loving scoldings, her care wrapping around Jessica like a warm shawl, and the children's laughter ringing through the park, their innocence a beacon she'd fight to preserve. Their faith in her was both a weighty burden and a radiant spark, pushing her forward with every determined step. Jessica inhaled deeply, the cool air steadying her racing thoughts. She whispered to herself to remain calm, to hold fast, to never falter. Each footfall on the narrow path home echoed with purpose, a rhythmic beat that matched the resolve pulsing through her veins. She wasn't just walking for herself, she was marching for everyone who believed in a world where fairness reigned. The streetlights flickered to life as dusk settled over the town, casting a golden glow that seemed to dance with her hopes. In their soft light, she felt an unshakable strength rise within her, a faith in change, a vow to guard the fragile flame of justice. She would protect it with everything she had, for herself and for every heart that trusted her to stand tall. But the dawn brought no peace. Jessica woke with a heaviness pressing against her chest, as though the night had draped her in a shroud of dread. Her mind replayed the previous evening in relentless, jagged fragments, a nightmare she couldn't shake. Each time her eyelids fluttered shut, those cold, unfeeling eyes stared back at her, belonging to the white officer who'd crossed a line she could never forgive. Fear coiled tight in her stomach, twisting with a raw, searing rage that threatened to consume her. Yet she refused to let it win. Rising from her bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror, bruises blooming across her skin like dark flowers, scrapes etching a story of pain she wouldn't let fade into silence. This wasn't a tale to dismiss, it was a call to action. Today, she would demand justice, and not just for the wounds on her body, but for the wound to her spirit, to the trust she'd built with her community. Slipping into her uniform, she fastened each button with trembling fingers, her movements deliberate, as if sealing her determination into the fabric. The mirror now showed a woman unbroken, her jaw set, her eyes alight with a quiet fury. She took a steadying breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Walking into the station that morning wasn't just about recounting the attack, it was about proving that no one, not even those who wore the same badge, could trample on morality without consequence. The lesson burned clear in her mind. Power, when wielded without restraint, corrupted everything it touched. Justice demanded accountability, and she would see it through. Stepping outside, the early morning air stung her cheeks, sharp and biting. The familiar road to the station felt alien now, its quiet stillness pressing against her like an unwelcome stranger. Fallen leaves, brittle and yellow, crunched beneath her boots, their decay mirroring the ache she carried. Every step reverberated through the silence, a solitary drumbeat in a world holding its breath. She forced her mind to focus, pushing away the chaos of emotion to sharpen her purpose. As she entered the station, the atmosphere shifted thick with unspoken tension. Eyes darted toward her, A kaleidoscope of reactions flickering across the faces of her fellow officers: shock, confusion, concern, and something deeper, something wary. Her bruises spoke louder than words, a visible testament to the betrayal she'd endured. No one dared ask, but the weight of their stares pressed against her as she strode forward, unyielding. She didn't pause, didn't waver. Her boots clicked against the floor as she made her way to the meeting room, her thoughts racing, words sharpening like blades in her mind. She rehearsed them silently, each syllable honed to cut through excuses and denial. Bursting into the room, she didn't wait for permission or pleasantries. Her voice sliced through the stillness, firm and commanding. Everyone into the meeting room now. There was no room for hesitation in her tone, no space for doubt. The officers moved swiftly, filing in with hurried steps, the door clicking shut behind them as they braced for what was to come. Jessica stood before them, her presence a towering force, her gaze steady yet brimming with the raw emotion she could no longer contain. "Last night," she began, her voice ringing out with a clarity that demanded attention. "I was attacked by 2 officers from this very station." She let the words hang in the air, watching the shock ripple through the room like a stone dropped into still water. "They didn't just disrespect my rank. They humiliated me, beat me, tore me down. But this isn't just about me. This is about a rot that's been growing among USA sickness of power abused without consequence." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye locked on her. Some widened in disbelief, others narrowed with a dawning realization. She could see a truth clawing its way into the light, touching corners they'd all ignored for too long. Slowly, anger flickered to life in their expressions, a shared indignation at the betrayal of their oath. Taking a deep breath, she pressed on, her voice unwavering. "What they did to me is only the beginning. I know they've used their authority to intimidate, to hurt others. That kind of violence, that abuse, it has no place here. Today, we end it." Her eyes met each of theirs, a silent challenge, a call to rise. "I'm asking you to stand with me, to bring those two to justice. This isn't just my fight, it's ours. It's the promise we made to protect this community, to uphold what's right." Her words grew stronger, resonating with a conviction that stirred the room. She saw fists clench, jaws tighten officers she'd worked beside for years, their outrage mirroring her own. They weren't just defending her. They were defending the very soul of their duty. From the back, a senior officer stepped forward brazen, a grizzled veteran who'd watched Jessica grow from a wide-eyed rookie into the force of nature she'd become. His voice, rough but warm, carried a weight of its own. "Jessica, what you're doing, it's not just justice. It's the heart of what we're supposed to be. You've got integrity, kid, and we've got your back. You're not in this alone." His words were a spark, igniting the room. One by one, they stood, young recruits with fire in their eyes, seasoned cops with weathered resolve pledging to root out the corruption staining their ranks. The space transformed, heavy disbelief giving way to a fierce, united purpose. Jessica's chest swelled with pride, gratitude flooding her senses. This wasn't her burden alone anymore, it was a collective stand, a line drawn against the shadows. She ended with a final, resounding call. "Starting today, we don't just hunt those two down. We rebuild the trust our community deserves. We prove justice doesn't bow, and anyone who twists power for their own gain will answer for it. This is about all of yous, about the oath we took to be guardians." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it thrummed with loyalty, with an iron will to see this through. Stepping out of the room, Jessica felt the air lighten around her, though her heart still churned with a storm of emotions. The weight of responsibility pressed harder now, but it was shared. She thought back to her early days, bright-eyed, eager, believing justice was a straight path. Reality had carved a different story, one of gray shadows and hard choices. She'd seen colleagues stumble, lured by greed or cowardice, each fall a scar on her faith. But today, she saw something else, a chance to mend what was broken, to show that power unchecked brought ruin, and justice, when fought for, could heal. The journey ahead was daunting, but she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a force ready to confront the darkness, not just for her, but for the town they all swore to protect. And as her footsteps echoed down the hall, each one rang with a promise. She'd never stop fighting. The journey astray had carved deep wounds into Jessica's soul, leaving behind a bitter mix of anguish and disillusionment. that had once threatened to drown her spirit. But on this day, as she stood in the midst of her team, something shifted within her. The room buzzed with an electric tension, and as her eyes swept across the faces of those around her, she saw not just determination but a fiery quiet, unshakable resolve that reignited a spark of hope she hadn't felt in far too long. Each gaze she met seemed to whisper a promise, not with words, but with the steady intensity of people who had chosen to rise above the chaos. For Jessica, this wasn't just another meeting, it was a turning point, a chance to prove that the seductive pull of power and temptation didn't have to claim everyone. She felt it in her bones. This wasn't hollow rhetoric or fleeting bravado. The sincerity radiating from her team pulsed like a living thing, wrapping around her heart and lifting it from the shadows. As she stepped out of the dimly lit station into the embrace of the afternoon sun, Jessica paused, letting the warmth spill over her. Rays of light danced across the cracked pavement of the station grounds, shimmering like fragments of a dream she'd almost forgotten. She inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs with a clarity that felt almost sacred, as if it were washing away the grime of doubt that had clung to her for so long. In that moment, her mind painted vivid, picturesque images of a community standing tall, unbroken, knit together by trust and purpose. She didn't just see her team anymore. She saw the faces of the people beyond these walls, ordinary citizens who looked to them with fragile hope, yearning for a justice system that didn't bend or break under the weight of corruption. Jessica knew that trust could only be rebuilt when every shadow was dragged into the light, when justice stood firm and impartial, unshaken by personal gain. And with the fierce unity she felt in her team, she Belyavedno. She knew they could shatter any barrier in their path. Her boots hit the ground with purpose as she walked, each step a quiet vow to carry the weight of this mission. Challenges loomed ahead, dark and jagged like storm clouds on the horizon, promising uncertainty and pain. But Jessica no longer felt the crushing loneliness that had once haunted her. She had allies now, comrades whose loyalty to justice burned as brightly as her own, and behind them, an entire community ready to stand as their foundation. Her eyes, once clouded with weariness, now blazed with a conviction that refused to flicker. What had happened today might only be the first ripple in a larger wave, but she was ready to face every trial, to fight tooth and nail for the ideals she held dear. Justice, she thought, wasn't just a concept, it was a living force, one that thrived in the hearts of those who refused to let it die, and she would defend it to her last breath. That unshakable determination fueled her as she took command of the operation, to hunt down the two officers who had attacked her. The intelligence was clear. They'd slipped out of town at dawn, their silhouettes vanishing into the thick, twisting trails of the nearby forest, a sprawling wilderness known only to a handful of locals, who'd spent years tracing its hidden paths. Jessica's mind raced as she pieced together their plan. These weren't men with options left to weigh. They were desperate, cornered animals, and she knew this chase would be relentless, a test of endurance and precision with no margin for mistakes. She led her tactical team into the forest's depths, the air growing thick and damp as they pressed forward. The terrain was unforgiving, steep inclines slick with moss, branches clawing at their uniforms, and dense foliage that swallowed the light. Every step was deliberate, their boots sinking into the soft earth as they moved in near silence, ears straining for any hint of their prey. The team fanned out, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine. Jessica's sharp eyes caught every clue the fugitives left behind. A snapped twig here, a smear of mud there, a stone kicked out of place. It was a trail only the keenest tracker could follow, and she was that tracker. She unfolded a weathered map, its edges curling from use, and marked potential escape routes with quick, decisive strokes. Her voice, low and steady, cut through the stillness as she ordered the team to split off to block the eastern trails, the other to circle round from the west. There would be no gaps, no cracks for these men to slip through. Ahead, a faint rustle broke the silence, and Jessica's hand shot up, freezing her team in place. Her heart thudded, not with fear, but with the cold certainty of purpose. She gestured sharply. Right flank, left flank, and the groups peeled off like shadows, tightening the noose. Meanwhile, the two officers stumbled through the undergrowth, their breaths ragged and uneven. their once pristine uniforms now streaked with dirt and sweat. Panic clawed at their chests as they darted glances over their shoulders, eyes wide and wild with the realization that escape was slipping through their fingers. They'd known Jessica wouldn't let this go easily. She wasn't the type to forgive or forget it. The weight of her pursuit crashed over them now like a tidal wave. The forest, once a refuge, turned against them. Leaves crunched loudly under their boots, and every bird that burst from the canopy seemed to scream their location to the world. Their arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing dread that sank deeper with every step. These were men who'd once wielded their badges like weapons, reveling in the power to bend others to their will. Now, as fugitives, they tasted the bitter helplessness they'd inflicted on so many a poetic twist that left them trembling. Jessica's team closed in, relentless as a storm. She tracked every sign with a predator's focus, her face a mask of steel despite the ache that lingered in her ribs from their earlier assault. The pain was there, a dull throb beneath her resolve, but she shoved it aside. This wasn't just about hair, it was about the rot they'd spread, the trust they'd shattered. She could still feel the sting of their betrayal, the humiliation of their fists crashing against her, the sneers they'd thrown her way. It wasn't just personal, it was a violation of everything she'd sworn to protect. Each step she took was a reclamation, a refusal to let their corruption win. Her team mirrored her intensity, their loyalty forged in the fire of her courage. They weren't just soldiers in this hunt, they were believers, united by a shared disgust for what these men had done. The chase reached its climax when one of the officers tripped, his foot catching on a gnarled root. He hit the ground hard, a choked gasp escaping his lips as his hands scrabbled in the dirt. His partner lunged to haul him up, desperation etched into every line of his face. But it was too late. Jessica and her team emerged from the trees, their silhouettes stark against the fading light. The air crackled with tension as they closed the circle, their expressions unyielding. The two men froze, their bravado crumbling into dust. They'd run out of tricks, out of time. Jessica stepped forward, her presence towering despite her modest frame. Her gaze sliced through them, sharp and unforgiving, locking onto the eyes of the men who'd dared to cross her. Inside, a storm of emotions: ragged anger, relief, a fierce satisfaction, but her face remained a fortress, revealing nothing. "Stand up," she commanded, her voice like ice, cutting through the heavy silence. "Your escape ends here. It's time to face what you've done." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. The officers' heads bowed, unable to meet her stare, their faces flushed with shame and defeat. Once, they'd strutted through the station with swagger, drunk on their own authority. Now, they were hollow shells, stripped bare by the justice they'd mocked. Handcuffs clicked round their wrists, the sound sharp and final, and they were led back through the forest in silence, flanked by Jessica and her team bearers of a justice that wouldn't bend. Back at the station, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Officers lined the halls, their eyes tracking the prisoners with a mix of disbelief and resolve. Jessica stood tall, facing the men who'd once been her brothers in arms, now reduced to something pitiful and small. "I want you to understand this," she said, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "You didn't just betray me, you betrayed this force, this community, every person who trusted us to protect them. You used your power to crush and control, but that ends now. Justice doesn't bend for men like you." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. In the eyes of her colleagues, she saw not just respect, but a shared fiery vow to root out corruption wherever it hid. This wasn't her victory alone, it was theirs, a testament to what they could achieve when they stood together. Later, in the quiet of her office, Jessica sat at her desk, her gaze drifting to the window. The day's events replayed in her mind, a whirlwind of adrenaline and revelation. She wondered about the system she fought for. Could it truly change, or was she chasing a mirage? The doubts crept in, soft and insidious, but then she remembered the faces of her team, the unwavering support that had carried her through. That was real, that was enough. She thought of the citizens outside these walls, the ones who'd suffered under the weight of corruption, and she knew this was just the beginning. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a battle, a promise kept by those brave enough to fight for it. And Jessica, with her team at her side, would keep fighting because the lesson was clear. Power could corrupt, but justice, when fueled by unity and resolve, would always rise stronger. Jessica had spent years watching the world crumble around her, families shattered like fragile glass under the weight of a few who wielded power with reckless abandon. She'd seen it all, to have temperance weeping as their children were unjustly targeted, neighbors turning against one another out of fear, all because of the unchecked arrogance of those within the police force who believed their badges granted them immunity. The pain of the oppressed gnawed at her soul, a constant ache that grew sharper with every story of despair she encountered. Their faces haunted her wide-eyed, pleading, desperate for someone to care. It was this relentless injustice that lit a fire within her, a burning resolve to rise up and right the wrongs she could no longer bear to witness in silence. On a chilly evening, the kind where the wind seemed to whisper secrets through the station's cracked windows, Jessica found herself standing in a dimly lit meeting room. The air was thick with tension as she faced her colleagues with arms crossed, others shifting uncomfortably in their creaky chairs. Her heart pounded beneath her uniform, but her gaze was unwavering, her eyes reflecting a steely determination that refused to flicker. She took a deep breath, the faint hum of the overhead lights filling the silence, and began to speak. Her voice carried the weight of her convictions, as she reminded them of their duty not just to enforce laws, but to uphold the trust of the community they served. She spoke of loyalty, not to each other's misdeeds, but to the people who looked to them for hope. She painted a picture of their noble mission, her words weaving through the room like threads of light piercing the shadows. Each syllable seemed to strike a chord, stirring something deep within her listeners. Pride flickered in their eyes, a renewed sense of purpose swelling in their chests. "We're not just here to keep order," she declared, her voice trembling with emotion yet steady with resolve. "We're the heartbeat of trust for this town. We can't let the selfish acts of a few stain the honor we're meant to carry." The room erupted in applause, a wave of unity crashing over them, and Jessica felt a quiet surge of hope. She wasn't alone. There were others who shared her dream, ready to stand shoulder to shoulder in the fight for what was right. Word of Jessica's impassioned stand spread like wildfire through the force, her story igniting a spark of inspiration that refused to be snuffed out. Officers who had once turned a blind eye, trapped in the suffocating cycle of corruption, began to feel the stirrings of change within themselves. They saw her not as a threat, but as a mirror reflecting the integrity they'd buried beneath years of compromise. The realization hit them hard. If they wanted a force they could be proud of, one that stood tall and untainted, it started with each choice, each act of honesty, each step toward accountability. Months later, after countless sleepless nights poring over evidence in her cramped office, the trial of 2 corrupt officers finally dawned. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, its wooden benches packed to the brim. Jessica's colleagues sat among the crowd, their uniforms crisp but their expressions heavy with expectation. Alongside them were townsfolk, ordinary people who'd borne the brunt of these officers' tyranny for far too long. There was the baker whose shop had been ransacked under false pretenses, his eyes weary but hopeful. The school teacher who'd been silenced with threats, her hands trembling as she clutched a handkerchief. They'd all come with a shared longing, a fragile dream that justice might finally mean something tangible, something they could hold onto instead of watching it slip through their fingers like sand. The 2 officers entered, their once proud strides reduced to hesitant shuffles. Gone was the swagger that had defined them, the smug grins they'd flashed while intimidating the powerless. Their eyes darted nervously, avoiding the piercing stares of those they'd wronged, their former comrades, their victims, the very people who'd once respected them simply for the titles they wore. Shame clung to them like a second skin, their faces pale and drawn, stripped of the bravado that had masked their cruelty. Fear flickered in their gazes, an emotion they'd never allowed themselves to feel when they held the upper hand. Jessica stepped up to the witness stand, her boots echoing softly against the polished floor. Her heart raced, but her voice emerged clear and unshaken, a beacon of strength amid the storm. She wasn't just a witness, she was the voice of every soul who'd suffered in the shadows. Too afraid to speak, with meticulous precision, she laid out the evidence, every damning detail of how these men had twisted their authority into a weapon. She described the moments they'd laughed as a widow coward, her pleas ignored, The times they'd forced a young father to his knees with threats, his dignity stripped away for their amusement. Her words cut through the room like a blade, slicing apart the flimsy excuses the defense tried to weave. The air grew heavy, every listener riveted, unable to tear their eyes from her. She didn't just recount facts, she exposed the rot at the core of these men, the arrogance that had fueled their reign of terror. It was a reckoning, a call to conscience that left no corner of the courtroom untouched. The defense scrambled, their voices thin and desperate as they argued that these were mere mistakes, the result of stress and tough calls on the job. They painted the officers as flawed, but not malicious, grasping at straws to soften the blow. But Jessica wouldn't let them hide. With every incident she revisited, her resolve hardened, her testimony leaving no room for doubt. The victims followed her, one by one, their voices trembling yet resolute. An elderly woman, her silver hair pulled back tightly, spoke through tears of the day she'd been mocked and humiliated for daring to question their actions, her frail hands twisting in her lap. A young man, barely out of his teens, recounted how they'd cornered him, their sneers burning into his memory as they forced him to bow to their whims. Each story peeled back another layer of the officer's false honor, laying bare the ugliness of their deeds. The courtroom held its breath, the weight of their pain undeniable, their courage unshakable. The defense fought on, dragging the trial out with pleas for mercy and claims of mitigating circumstances. But their words were hollow against the mountain of evidence and the raw fury of a community betrayed. The judge, his face etched with solemnity, finally delivered the verdict. The officers would face the full consequences of their actions. No rank, no badge could shield them now. As the sentence rang out, the room exploded with emotion. Some wept openly, tears of relief streaming down weathered faces. Others exchanged quiet, satisfied nods, a flicker of peace settling over them. Jessica stood still, her expression calm, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. She'd done it not just for herself, but for every person who'd looked to her as a symbol of the justice they'd craved. As she stepped outside, the cool air brushing her face, she inhaled deeply. This fight was over, but she knew the war against injustice stretched far beyond this moment. Yet today, she'd proven something vital. Justice wasn't a distant fantasy. It was real, tangible, and worth every ounce of struggle, so long as there were those brave enough to defend it. This victory rippled beyond Jessica, touching the entire town. It was a triumph of faith, of courage, a promise that change was possible. But she knew this was only the beginning. Locking up to corrupt officers didn't uproot the deeper rot within the Forcia system that had quietly nurtured abuse and bias for years. The realization stung, a bitter truth that fueled her next mission. She couldn't stop at punishment. She had to rebuild, to reshape the force into something worthy of trust. In the weeks that followed, Jessica threw herself into the work. Her small apartment became a war room, papers strewn across the table, coffee mugs piling up as she drafted plans for reform. She knew the road would be treacherous, lined with resistance from those who clung to the old ways. But retreat wasn't in her nature. This wasn't just her job, it was her calling, a vow to restore the community's faith in those meant to protect them. She started with training, hauling in experts to teach cultural sensitivity and peaceful conflict resolution skills the force had never truly embraced. In a stuffy conference room, she stood before her colleagues once more, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "We're starting fresh today," she said, her voice warm but firm. "Strength isn't just in our hands, it's in our hearts, in how we listen, in how we care. Justice isn't about power over others, it's about lifting them up." At first, some bristled, unused to the idea that authority could coexist with kindness. But as the sessions unfolded, something shifted. They role-played tense scenarios, calming an irate shopkeeper with words instead of threats, soothing a frightened child with patience. Jessica watched their faces soften, their shoulders relax, a dawning understanding replacing their doubts. They were beginning to see it. This wasn't weakness, it was a stronger, truer way to serve. The small town buzzed with anticipation as its people gathered in the community hall, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. Jessica, the newly appointed police chief, stood at the front, her posture steady but her eyes warm with genuine care. She wasn't there to lecture or dictate. Instead, she opened the floor to the townsfolk, urging them to pour out their hearts, not just the frustrations that gnawed at them, but the dreams they held for a safer, kinder future. The room grew still as an elderly woman rose, her frail hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of her chair. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke of a night years ago when her son, a gentle soul with a quick laugh, had been roughed up by officers for no reason other than the color of his skin. The memory still haunted her, every siren a reminder of her fear, every uniform a shadow of distrust. Jessica leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she absorbed every word, her heart tightening with a mix of sorrow and resolve. She met the woman's gaze and promised, her voice steady as steel, that no one under her command would ever wield power like a weapon again. It wasn't just a vow to the woman, it was a pledge to herself, a line drawn in the sand against the abuses that had festered too long. Beyond those heartfelt meetings, Jessica rolled up her sleeves and set to work on something tangibly system, where anyone could report misconduct without dread creeping up their spine. She envisioned a process so safe and anonymous that even the most timid soul could speak up, knowing their words wouldn't boomerang back with retribution. To her, this wasn't just about cracking open the police department's dusty windows for a little sunlight. It was about forging a lifeline of trust between the badge and the people it served. Accountability, she believed, was the heartbeat of justice, and she'd be damned if she let it flatline on her watch. As the weeks unfolded, Jessica threw herself into the grind, her days stretching into nights as she rallied her team around a vision that felt both radical and right. She could sense their hesitation. At first, some officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, arms crossed, wondering if this was just another fleeting sermon from the top. But Jessica didn't flinch. She knew change wasn't a switch you flipped. It was a garden you tended, day by painstaking day. She led not with barked orders, but with quiet strength, stepping into the fray whenever trouble brewed, whether it was a heated dispute in the precinct or a tense standoff on a dusty street. Her patience was a lighthouse, guiding her team through storms of doubt, and soon they began to see her not just as their chief, but as a compass pointing toward something better. The town itself started to shift under her steady hand. Where patrols once felt like silent threats rolling through the streets, they morphed into something softer, moments where officers swapped nods and smiles with shopkeepers, or paused to toss a ball back to a kid in the park. Jessica watched it unfold with a swelling pride, her sharp eyes catching the flicker of gratitude in a mother's glance, or the tentative wave from a porch. One crisp morning, as the first rays of dawn painted the station's brick walls gold, she found a letter slipped under her door. It was penned in careful, looping handwriting from a family who'd once bolted their doors at the sight of a cruiser. Their words spilled out like a confession. They'd been afraid for so long, skeptical of every promise. But now they felt safe again, believed in the force she was shaping. Jessica traced her fingers over the ink, her throat tightening with a rush of gratitude and purpose. Standing by her office window, the town sprawling out before her in a patchwork of rooftops and winding roads, she let the moment sink in. This was why she'd taken the job, why she'd staked her soul on this fight. Justice wasn't a trophy to polish, it was a promise kept, a foundation laid brick by brick for a future where no one had to cower. But the road hadn't been smooth, and Jessica knew it never would be. Just days earlier, she'd sat in another packed meeting, the air thick with unspoken fears. A man in a faded jacket stood, his voice rough as gravel, recounting how officers had once laughed as they smashed his taillight, then ticketed him for it. A young woman followed, her hands twisting nervously as she described being ignored when she'd begged for help. After a break-in, each story landed like a stone in Jessica's chest, heavy with the weight of betrayal. She didn't just listen, she felt it, the sting of every injustice fueling a fire in her gut. She swore to them, and to herself, that she'd claw her way to fairness no matter how deep the rot went. She couldn't do it alone, though, and she didn't pretend to. Late into the night, she huddled with her team leaders in the station's cramped conference room, the table littered with coffee cups and crumpled notes. She laid out her plan with a fierce clarity. Reform wasn't optional, it was urgent. A now or never call to prove they could protect everyone, not just the loudest or the wealthiest. Her lieutenants nodded, some with jaws set, others with eyes alight, and she knew she'd found her allies in this uphill climb. Among her first moves was a reckoning for two officers whose corruption had stained the Badgia pair, who'd strutted through town like petty kings, bending rules to flex their muscle. Jessica didn't just fire them, she made them pay literally, demanding they cover the cost of her battered old sedan, dented and scratched from years of her chasing down leads and racing to calls. That car wasn't just metal to hair, it was a testament to every sleepless night, every sacrifice she'd made to wear the uniform with honor. Forcing them to foot the bill wasn't petty revenge, it was a loud, clear message that power came with a price tag, and no one got a free pass to trample it. The lesson rippled through the force like a shockwave. Actions had consequences, and Jessica was the one holding the scales. As spring bled into summer, she doubled down, hauling in experts from across the state to run workshops that felt more like boot camps for the soul. Officers grumbled at first, slouched in folding chairs as trainers preached cultural sensitivity and de-escalation tactics. What's compassion got to do with cuffing a perp? One veteran snorted, his arms folded tight. But Jessica stood at the back, watching as they ran through scenarios, steering a shouting drunk without a fist, talking down a scared teen instead of drawing steel. Slowly, the room changed. She saw it in their faces, skepticism melting into something like revelation. One officer, a burly man named Tom, who'd once shrugged off complaints with a smirk, lingered after a session, his voice low. "I get it now," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're not just the muscle, we're the shield, too." Jessica clapped his shoulder, her smile fierce with pride. They were starting to see it. Policing wasn't just about barking orders. It was about stitching a frayed town back together with fairness and care. The community meetings didn't stop, either. Jessica kept the doors open, soaking in every voice that dared to speak. A mechanic with grease-stained hands told her about bribes he'd paid to dodge trumped-up fines. A grandmother whispered about nights she'd prayed her grandson wouldn't cross the wrong cop. Each tale was a thread in the tapestry of trust she was weaving, and she leaned into it, letting their hopes and hurts shape her next move. Those gatherings became more than vents for old wounds she turned into bridges, fragile at first, then stronger with every handshake and shared story. Late one night, as the town slept under a blanket of stars, Jessica stood at the station's window, the cool glass pressing against her palm. The streetlights cast long shadows over the empty roads, and she let her mind wander over the months past. Resistance from old guard cops, the whispers of pushback from shadowy corners clinging to the status quo. There'd been moments she'd faltered, staring at the ceiling in the dark, wondering if she was shouting into a void. But then she'd see that elderly woman's tear-streaked face, or hear the mechanic's gruff thanks, and the doubt would burn away like fog in the sun. She wasn't alone anymore. Beside her stood officers like Tom, who'd traded cynicism for purpose, and Sarah, a rookie whose quiet courage shone in every call she took. Together, they hashed out plans in the station's flickering light, mapping a system where transparency wasn't a buzzword, but a lifeline. Jessica knew the fight was far from won. There'd be more battles, more nights of staring down the darkness. But as she stepped outside, the streetlights bathing her in their soft glow, her heart thrummed with a stubborn, unshakable hope. This wasn't just a job, or even a town, it was her home, a place that deserved a justice rooted in truth. She thought of the kids who'd one day run these streets without a flinch, of the elders who'd sleep easy knowing fairness wasn't a fairy tale. That was the justice she'd bleed for, not just punishment, but peace. A promise that power would never again crush the powerless. With every step she took into the night, Jessica carried that vision, her boots striking the pavement like a drumbeat for change. The road ahead was long, but she'd walk it, unrelenting, until the light of justice broke through for good. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sprawling city of Los Angeles in hues of orange and purple, Simon Johnson, the 22-year-old daughter of Hollywood titan Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, guided her sleek black Mercedes SUV along the winding curves of Sunset Boulevard. The soft hum of music floated through the speakers, a gentle backdrop to her thoughts as she mentally rehearsed her wrestling moves for the training session scheduled at dawn. Her evening workout had left her tired but invigorated, and the quiet drive home felt like a small reward, a moment of calm in her otherwise whirlwind life. That tranquility shattered in an instant when the harsh glare of red and blue lights erupted in her rearview mirror, slicing through the dusk like a predator's warning. Simon's brow furrowed as she glanced at her speedometer, steady, well within the limit. Confusion flickered in her chest, but she steadied herself, drawing on the lessons her father had drilled into her since childhood. Stay calm, be respectful, follow protocol. She eased the SUV to the right side of the road, killed the music, and rested both hands visibly on the steering wheel, her fingers trembling slightly despite her resolve. Through the side mirror, she saw a figure approaching Golfiker James Keller, a 15-year veteran of the LAPD, his broad silhouette cutting an imposing figure against the fading light. His hand hovered near his holstered gun, a gesture that sent a chill down her spine even before he reached her window. Keller stood 6 feet tall, his cold blue eyes glinting beneath the brim of his cap, his face etched with a scowl that seemed carved into his very being. In the community, whispers about him lingered like a bad smell, tales of aggression and intimidation that no one dared speak aloud. License and registration, he barked, his voice sharp and devoid of warmth, the flashlight in his hand swinging up to blast her face with a beam so bright it forced her eyes into a squint. Simon swallowed the unease rising in her throat, her heart thudding as she replied, "Of course, officer," her tone steady despite the hostility radiating from him. "May I reach for my purse to get my license? Just hurry up and don't try anything stupid," Keller snapped, his words laced with venom. As Simon carefully leaned toward her purse, her movements deliberate and slow, she caught a glimpse of his partner, Officer Rodriguez, lingering near the patrol car. Rodriguez shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his dark eyes darting between Keller and the ground, a faint crease of discomfort on his brow. Something about the scene felt off, wrong in a way Simon couldn't quite name, but she pressed forward, retrieving her documents with the calm professionalism her father had always modeled. "Here you go, sir," she said, extending her license and registration toward him. Keller snatched them from her hand, his fingers brushing hers with a roughness that made her flinch. His eyes narrowed as they scanned the name Johnson, and a sneer twisted his lips. "So, you think having a famous daddy means you can drive however you want in my city?" he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. Simon's pulse quickened, a hot flush of fear and indignation surging through her. But she kept her composure. "No, sir," she replied, her voice firm yet polite. "I wasn't speeding or breaking any traffic laws. May I ask why you pulled me over?" "You made an illegal lane change back there," Keller shot back, his tone accusatory, though Simon knew it was a lie. She'd been meticulous, signaling well in advance, checking her mirrors, driving with the care she always took. "Officer, I'm certain I used my turn signal and changed lanes safely," she said, her words measured. "If you have dashcam footage, I'd be happy to review it with you." Her offer, meant to de-escalate, only seemed to ignite something darker in Keller. His face flushed red, and he leaned into her window, his breath hot and sour as he growled, "Are you calling me a liar, girl?" The air grew thick with tension. On the sidewalk, a few passers-by slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued. Some fumbled for their phones, the faint glow of screens illuminating their faces as they began to record. Back at the patrol car, Rodriguez's unease deepened as it rubbed the back of his neck, his jaw tight, clearly sensing the situation spiraling beyond reason. "No, sir," Simon said, her voice trembling slightly as she fought to stay steady. "I'm just trying to understand." Keller's eyes darkened, and he barked, "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why?" Simon ventured, her hand instinctively drifting toward her phone. She wanted to document this, to have some proof of the surreal nightmare unfolding before her. Keller's gaze snapped to her movement, and his expression twisted into something feral. "I said get out of the car now." Simon nodded, reaching for her seatbelt with shaky fingers. But before she could unbuckle it, Keller lunged forward, yanking her door open with a force that made the hinges groan. "Officer, please," Simon began, her voice rising with a mix of fear and plea. "I'm cooperating." Her words were cut short as Keller's fist slammed into the side of her face. the impact a thunderclap that reverberated through her skull. Pain exploded behind her eyes, and the world tilted as gasps and shouts erupted from the growing crowd. Rodriguez finally jolted forward, his voice cracking as he yelled, "Keller, stand down." Simon's head spun, but her instincts kicked. Inch fumbled for her phone and pressed the emergency contact button, the call connecting instantly to her father's security team, trained for moments exactly like this. Blood trickled from a cut on her lip, warm and metallic against her skin, as Keller seized her arm and dragged her from the car. His grip was iron, his movements fueled by a rage that seemed to blind him to the dozen phones now capturing his every action. The crowd swelled, their murmurs turning to cries of outrage, yet Keller pressed on, oblivious or indifferent to the storm he was brewing. Across town, on the set of his latest blockbuster, Dwayne Johnson's phone buzzed in his pocket. He was mid-scene, sweat glistening on his brow under the studio lights, when the call came through, a call that would soon turn his world upside down and set off a reckoning that would shake the LAPD to its foundations. The sun had vanished now, swallowed by the night, but the darkness was alive with a restless energy. Within minutes, grainy videos of a racist cop assaulting The Rock's daughter began to ricochet across social media, each share amplifying the outrage. 20 minutes after the punch landed, Dwayne was tearing through the city in his black Ford Raptor, his knuckles white as he clenched the wheel, his security team trailing in 2 SUVs behind him. His chest heaved with a fury he could barely contain, his mind racing with images of Simon's little girl hurt and helpless at the hands of a man sworn to protect. At the scene, chaos reigned. Nearly 100 people had gathered, a sea of flashing phone screens and angry voices. Simon sat handcuffed in the back of the patrol car, her cheeks swelling, her lips stinging, her dignity battered but intact. Rodriguez stood toe-to-toe with Keller, his courage finally breaking through. "This is completely out of line, Keller," he shouted, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "You assaulted an unarmed civilian on camera. What were you thinking?" Keller's face was a mask of fury as he whirled on his partner. "Stay out of this, Rodriguez." She was resisting arrest. Resisting what arrest? Rodriguez fired back, incredulous. She was sitting in her car, following instructions, the dash cam, the body cams. They caught everything. The crowd's anger surged, a low roar building as several onlookers recognized Simon. Hashtags like "Justice for Simone" erupted online, and news vans began rolling toward the scene, their satellite dishes gleaming under the streetlights. In his truck, Dwayne's phone lit up with a call from his lawyer, Benjamin Hayes, a titan of criminal defense in LA. "Dwayne, I've already contacted Internal Affairs," Hayes said, his voice clipped and urgent. "Keller's got a history of 6 complaints of excessive force in 3 years, all against minorities. This isn't his first mess, but it'll be his last." "Is Simone okay?" Dwayne asked, his voice a low growl. "She's at Western Division Station." Hayes replied, "They're charging her with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. Complete nonsense. We've got multiple videos showing she never touched him." Dwayne's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening as he closed in on the station. Calls flooded in from friends, media, even the mayor, but he tuned them out. His focus singular, his daughter. Inside the station, Keller strutted like a king, oblivious to the firestorm he'd ignited. His fellow officers watched him with a mix of disgust and disbelief, their whispers trailing him as he passed. In her office, Captain Sarah Martinez sat hunched over her desk, the viral footage playing on her screen for the 3rd time. Each viewing deepened the pit in her stomach. Long suspected Keller was a loose cannon, but this was undeniable. Her door flew open and an officer stammered, "Captain, Dwayne Johnson is here." The station fell silent as The Rock stepped inside, his towering 6'5" frame filling the doorway, his presence a quiet storm. "I'm here for my daughter," he said, his voice steady but laced with a fury that made the air tremble. His eyes locked on Keller, whose bravado crumbled in an instant, replaced by the dawning realization that his abuse of power had summoned a force he couldn't outrun. That night stretched on, a promise of peace and fairness whispered through the darkness, a promise that justice, though delayed, would rise with the dawn. For Simon, for her father, for the city. It was a lesson carved in pain, Power unchecked breeds tyranny, but consequences, when they come, can topple even the proudest thrones. The air in the police station felt thick and suffocating. As Dwayne Johnson emerged from the precinct captain's office, his broad shoulders tense with a storm of emotions brewing beneath his calm exterior. The captain, a woman with tired eyes and a voice softened by years of navigating chaos, turned to him with a mixture of relief and urgency. "Mr. Johnson, please follow me," she said, her tone carrying the weight of a decision long overdue. "We're releasing your daughter right now, effective immediately. And I need you to know Officer Keller has been suspended. There's an investigation pending, and it's going to dig deep." Her words were measured, but Dwayne could hear the tremor of unease beneath them, as if she, too, feared the reckoning that loomed on the horizon. They moved swiftly down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway toward the holding area, their footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of impending justice. Dwayne's mind churned with a torrent of thoughts: anger, protectiveness, and a gnawing sense of betrayal that someone sworn to uphold the law could so callously abuse it. His daughter, Simone, was waiting behind those cold steel bars, a victim not just of one man's cruelty, but of a system that had allowed it to fester. As they approached the holding area, the tension in the room spiked, a palpable electricity that crackled in the air. Officers and staff lingered nearby, their faces a mix of curiosity and dread, sensing that something monumental was unfolding. Then came the voice that shattered the fragile silence: Officer James Keller, his tone dripping with arrogance and defiance. "She was resisting," he began, his words slithering out like a half-formed excuse. Before he could finish, Dwayne whirled around, his towering frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the smaller man whole. His eyes blazed with a fury so intense it could have ignited the room, a controlled inferno that held everyone in its grip. The onlookers froze, their breaths caught in their throats, half expecting the action hero they knew from the silver screen to unleash a fist that would send Keller sprawling across the linoleum floor. The image of The Rock delivering swift, cinematic justice danced in their minds, a scene straight out of one of his blockbuster films. But Dwayne didn't swing. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that cut deeper than any shout ever could. "Officer Keller," he said, each syllable laced with a quiet menace that sent a shiver down the spines of everyone present. "You just assaulted my little girl, on camera." Because of the color of her skin, his gaze locked onto Keller's, unyielding and piercing, as if he could see straight through to the rot in the man's soul. "You'd love for me to lose it right now, wouldn't you? To give you the fight you're itching for. But I'm not going to hand you that satisfaction. No, I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to make sure you never pin that badge on your chest again. I'm going to make sure the whole world knows exactly what kind of coward hides behind that uniform." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, like the rumble of thunder promising a deluge. Keller's face drained of color, his smug facade crumbling as the reality of his situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. He'd miscalculated, picked a fight with a man whose strength wasn't just in his fists, but in his resolve. A father whose love for his daughter fueled a determination far more dangerous than physical force. The room remained silent, the weight of Dwayne's promise settling over everyone like a storm cloud ready to burst. Moments later, the holding cell door creaked open and Simone rushed out, her face bruised and swollen, but her eyes alight with a fierce, unbroken spirit. She threw herself into her father's arms, and he enveloped her in a hug so tight it seemed he could shield her from the world itself. Above them, the whirring blades of news helicopters sliced through the sky, their cameras trained on the station below. Outside, the faint chants of gathering protesters began to swell, a chorus of outrage that signaled this was only the beginning. For Officer James Keller, the nightmare he'd sown was blooming into something monstrous, a reckoning that would stretch far beyond these walls. The next morning, Los Angeles awoke to a city on fire with unrest. Thousands of protesters encircled the Western Division police station, their signs held high like battle standards: justice for Simone, and police brutality, their voices merging into a roar that shook the pavement. News vans clogged the streets, reporters from every major network jostling for position, their microphones thrust toward anyone who might offer a soundbite for the story. that had seized the nation's attention. Inside his sprawling Beverly Hills mansion, Dwayne sat at a polished oak table, his daughter beside him, her face still bearing the marks of Keller's brutality. Across from them, their lawyer, Benjamin Hayes, a weary man with sharp eyes and a relentless energy, pored over a tablet overflowing with evidence. "Look at this," Benjamin said, his voice tinged with a mix of triumph and disbelief as he swiped through the screen. 3 more women came forward overnight, young, all women of color, all with stories that mirror Simone's: harassment, violence. Keller's hands all over them. Simone leaned forward, wincing as the movement tugged at her tender bruises, her expression hardening with resolve. "Dad," she said, her voice steady despite the pain, "we have to help them too. This isn't just about me anymore, it's about all of them." Dwayne's jaw tightened, pride and sorrow warring in his chest as he nodded. His phone buzzed incessantly on the table calls from wrestling legends, Hollywood heavyweights, civil rights icons, all offering support, resources, anything he needed to turn this fight into a crusade. Meanwhile, across town in a cramped, dimly lit apartment, Officer Keller faced a spiraling crisis of his own making. News crews camped outside his building, their lenses trained on his windows like vultures circling a dying animal. His social media feeds drowned in a deluge of furried thousands of messages branding him a monster, a disgrace. His wife, pale and trembling, had packed a bag and fled with their 2 young children to her mother's house, unable to bear the suffocating shame that now clung to their family. The phone rang, cutting through the oppressive silence, and Keller fumbled to answer it, his hands shaking. "James," came the gruff voice of the police union rep, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We can't defend you. The evidence is a mountain, and the spotlight's too bright. You're on your own." Keller sank onto the edge of his sagging couch, the words echoing in his skull as the TV blared live coverage of a press conference at City Hall. The mayor stood tall at the podium, flanked by the police chief and a row of stern-faced council members, his voice booming through the speakers. "The city of Los Angeles condemns Officer James Keller's actions in the strongest possible terms," he declared, his eyes flashing with resolve. "We're launching a full investigation not just into this incident, but into his entire career. And effective immediately, we're overhauling police training and oversight. This ends now." Back at the Johnson home, Dwayne's phone lit up again this time. It was Officer Rodriguez, Keller's former partner, his voice thick with guilt. "Mr. Johnson, I need to testify against him. I should have stopped him years ago. I'm sorry. I've got records, proof of other incidents he buried. I'll give you everything." It was the break they'd been waiting for. Dwayne patched Rodriguez through to Benjamin, who sprang into action, assembling statements and piling evidence into an arsenal of truth. By afternoon, the story exploded further. Simone had leaked Keller's personnel file to the press. The pages revealed a chilling history: 12 complaints of excessive force, all quietly dismissed, for documented cases of racial profiling. Lost in a maze of red tape, to domestic disturbance calls to his own home, hushed up by colleagues. At the station, the police chief summoned his command staff to an emergency meeting, their faces grim as they grappled with a reputation in tatters. "We're hemorrhaging trust," the chief barked, slamming a fist on the table. "We need answers, and we need them yesterday." Just then, a young officer burst through the door, his face flushed with urgency. "Chief, you've got to see this," he said, thrusting his phone forward. The screen glowed with dashboard footage from 6 months pre-Orkler, in grainy black and white, brutalizing another young woman of color in a chilling echo of Simone's assault. The timestamp glared accusingly, proof the department had known and done nothing. Across town, Keller sat alone in his apartment, the walls closing in as his phone rang once more. "Officer Keller," came the icy voice of an internal affairs investigator, "we need you in here now. Bring your badge and gun." The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over a city teetering on the edge of upheaval. That evening, Dwayne and Simone appeared on a national broadcast, their faces resolute against a backdrop of flickering studio lights. Simone spoke first, her voice ringing with a strength that belied her injuries. "What happened to me was awful," she said. "But it happens every day to people who don't have a famous dad to fight for them. We're going to use our voice to stand up for them too. Dwayne gazed at her, his heart swelling with pride. They'd chosen not violence, but a fiercer weapon, justice wielded through exposure, reform forged through unity. As night blanketed Los Angeles, Keller's reign of terror unraveled, but the movement for accountability ignited, a flame that would burn brighter with each passing day. Dawn broke on the third day, and the scandal erupted anew. Internal Affairs had spent a sleepless night dissecting Keller's work laptop, unearthing a cesspool of racist emails and texts swapped with a clique of officers. At the Western Division, Captain Martinez, a stern woman with gray streaks in her hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, called her staff into a cramped meeting room. "We've identified 8 others tied to Keller's hate-fueled stunts," she announced, her voice sharp as a blade. "This rot runs deeper than we imagined." At his home gym, Dwayne sat motionless, the weights untouched, sweat beading on his brow as he watched the news ticker tally Keller's sins. His phone buzzed Benjamin again, breathless with urgency. "Dwayne, we've got a bombshell." A former dispatcher just came forward with recordings Keller bragging about targeting minorities, calling it his cleanup operation. Dwayne's fists clenched, rage simmering beneath his ironclad focus. This wasn't just about one rogue cop anymore. It was a war against a corrupt system, across town. Keller's personal hell deepened. As he stepped outside to face Internal Affairs, a mob of protesters blocked his path, their chants a deafening tide of fury. Someone had leaked his address online, and now the crowd pressed in, held back only by a thin line of officers who looked at him with disgust. Inside the EA office, Keller slumped in a chair, his bravado splintering as investigators laid out a dossier thick with damning testimony. 17 officers are talking, the lead investigator said, dropping the file with a thud. "Your little empire's collapsing, Keller. The unions cut you loose. Your finish should know it's just a question of who else you drag down." At a downtown law office, Officer Rodriguez sat hunched over a table, his hands trembling as he unburdened years of guilt. "I saw it all," he said, his voice breaking. "Keller's brutality, the cover-ups, the threats that silenced us. He had dirt on every one of that's how he stayed untouchable. But targeting Simone, that was his fatal misstep." By afternoon, the scandal snowballed. A group of senior officers stepped forward, confessing they'd buried Keller's past misdeeds, their admissions threatening to topple the department's leadership. At City Hall, the mayor faced the press again, his face etched with determination. "We're forming an independent oversight committee," he declared, "and Mr. Johnson has agreed to advise us. This isn't just punishment, it's a promise of change." The lesson was clear: power, when twisted and abused, invites its own downfall. Keller had wielded his badge like a weapon, believing himself invincible, but just as slow, relentless, and fueled by the voices of the wrong had caught him in its grip. For Dwayne and Simone, it was a victory not of vengeance, but of purpose, a testament that even the mightiest fall when confronted by the unyielding strength of truth. The sun blazed over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the streets where a quiet revolution was unfolding. Amid the hum of a peaceful rally, Simon Johnson stood resolute, her body still bearing the faint yellowing bruises from a brutal encounter that had ignited a firestorm. Despite the ache in her bones, she had insisted on attending, her presence radiating a strength that transcended physical pain. Surrounded by civil rights leaders and community activists, she gripped the microphone, her voice steady yet trembling with emotion. "My father always said real strength isn't about throwing fists," she told the swelling crowd, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's about standing tall for what's right, especially when the world tries to knock you down." Her words weren't fueled by bitterness or a thirst for vengeance. They carried a deeper plea for a system so fractured it had nearly crushed her, to be rebuilt into something just. The crowd roared in agreement, their signs swaying like a forest in the wind. But Simon's heart pounded with a mix of pride and sorrow, knowing this fight was bigger than her own scars. Miles away, in the dim, claustrophobic confines of an Internal Affairs interrogation room, Officer James Keller sat slumped in a metal chair, his once arrogant demeanor unraveling like a threadbare coat. Hours of relentless questioning had worn him down, his defiance crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he began to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper, naming names that sent shockwaves through the room. Each syllable exposed a sprawling web of corrupt officers who had shielded his abuses for years, men and women who had turned a blind eye or worse, encouraged his reign of terror. His confession wasn't just a personal surrender. It was the key that would unlock the largest purge of crooked cops in LAPD history. As he spoke, the investigators exchanged grim looks, their pens scratching furiously against notepads, aware that this moment would redefine the department forever. Keller, once a predator cloaked in a badge, now faced the bitter truth. Power unchecked was a house of cards waiting to collapse. As the day waned, the golden hues of dusk painted the Johnson family home, where Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson stood in his living room, his massive frame silhouetted against the window. The doorbell chimed, a soft intrusion into his swirling thoughts, and he opened it to find Sarah Keller, James's wife, standing there, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tissue, her voice breaking as she forced out the words. "I knew what he was," she said, her eyes darting to the floor as if searching for absolution in the cracks of the hardwood. "I saw the signs late nights, the anger, the way he'd smirk when he thought no one was watching. I should have said something years ago. Maybe your daughter wouldn't have suffered if I had." Her guilt hung heavy in the air, a suffocating fog of regret. Dwayne's expression softened, his own pain tempered by empathy. He understood that Sarah, too, was a casualty of her husband's tyranny, a woman trapped in silence by fear and shame. "What matters now is the truth's out," he said gently, his deep voice a steady anchor. "Real change is coming, and that's what we hold on to." She nodded, tears spilling anew, and as she turned to leave, Dwayne watched her go, his heart heavy with the realization that justice, while necessary, often left a trail of broken lives in its wake. By nightfall, Captain Maria Martinez stood alone in her office at LAPD headquarters, the faint glow of her desk lamp illuminating a wall plastered with photographs' faces of officers, now implicated in Keller's scandal. Her dark eyes traced each image, her jaw tight with a mix of anger and resolve. The department she'd served for decades was a shadow of what it once was, its honor tarnished by the very people sworn to uphold it. She ran a hand through her graying hair, exhaustion tugging at her, but beneath it burned a flicker of hope. "Maybe this is what we needed," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city beyond her window. A reckoning to start over. Outside, Los Angeles glittered under a blanket of stars, oblivious to the storm brewing within its police force. Down in the county jail, Keller sat in a stark holding cell, the cold concrete walls closing in around him. His badge and gun symbols of the authority he'd wielded like a weapon were gone, stripped away along with his career. He stared at the floor, his mind replaying the moment he'd raised his fist against Simon Johnson, a single act of arrogance that had unraveled everything. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant clang of cell doors, a reminder that justice, impartial and unyielding, had finally caught up to him. The fourth day of the scandal dawned with chaos. Before the sun had fully risen, the city erupted with the sound of sirens as early morning raids swept through neighborhoods, netting 12 officers tied to Keller's corrupt network. FBI agents stormed police headquarters, their crisp suits a stark contrast to the disheveled uniforms of the arrested. Chief Daniel Wilson stood before a sea of microphones, his weathered face etched with strain as reporters fired questions like bullets. The revelation that over 24 officers had buried Keller's crimes had shattered public trust, leaving the department exposed and bleeding. "We're cleaning house," Wilson declared, his voice clipped and resolute, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of despair. Every officer, every supervisor who knew and did nothing feel answer for it. The press scribbled furiously, the air thick with tension, while across town, Keller languished in his jail cell, a fallen king stripped of his throne. The inmates around him, men he'd once cuffed with smug satisfaction, watched him with icy glee, their whispers a chorus of retribution. Word of his downfall had spread like wildfire, and in their gazes, he saw the reflection of his own cruelty staring back. At the Johnson residence, Dwayne had transformed his home theater into a war room for reform. Maps sprawled across the walls, dotted with red pins marking sites of past police brutality, a grim tapestry of systemic failure. He sat with civil rights attorneys and community leaders, his broad shoulders hunched as he listened to Benjamin Hayes, a sharp-eyed lawyer with a fire in his voice. "We've got a pattern here," Hayes said, jabbing a finger at the clusters of pins. Keller and his crew targeted specific neighborhoods: Spur, Black, Latin upbringing on kids who couldn't fight back. Simon stood nearby, her fading bruises a quiet testament to her survival. She studied the maps, her fingers brushing a pin as she whispered, "Every one of these is someone who was too scared to speak until now." Her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with a growing resolve that mirrored her father's. Dwayne caught her eye, pride swelling in his chest, though beneath it lingered a gnawing guilt that he hadn't protected her sooner. Across the city, Sarah Keller moved through her house like a ghost, packing boxes under the weight of a crumbling life. Her husband's frozen assets and the avalanche of legal bills had forced her hand to sell everything and start over. As she sorted through years of memories, her fingers brushed a hidden folder tucked behind a bookshelf in James's office. Her breath hitched as she opened it, revealing photograph-strippy shots of beaten suspects, their faces frozen in pain, with James grinning beside them. Her stomach churned, bile rising in her throat as she realized the depth of his sadism. With shaking hands, she dialed Benjamin Hayes, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "You need to see this." The evidence she delivered would tighten the noose round Keller's neck. But for Sarah, it was a desperate bid to reclaim some shred of dignity from the wreckage her silence had helped create. At the district attorney's office, prosecutors huddled over a mountain of evidence: hundreds of illegal arrests, falsified reports, and civil rights violations stretching back years. Lead prosecutor Elena Vasquez paced the room, her sharp heels clicking against the tile. "We're talking federal charges," she told her team, her voice firm despite the exhaustion lining her face. "Conspiracy, obstruction, civil rights abuse." Colors looking at decades. The room buzzed with a mix of triumph and disbelief, the scale of the corruption almost too vast to comprehend. Meanwhile, Dwayne received a call that stopped him cold. The Attorney General's office, their tone urgent. "Your daughter's case has gone national," the voice on the line said. "We want to partner with you on legislation reform, coast to coast." Dwayne glanced at Simon, who met his gaze with a fierce nod. Their fight had outgrown their personal pain, blossoming into a movement that could reshape policing everywhere. In the shadows of the department, Officer Miguel Rodriguez, a weary man with haunted eyes, worked tirelessly with reform advocates. Once a reluctant bystander, he'd become a whistleblower, his testimony cracking open the floodgates. "It's a cancer," he told investigators, his hands clenched into fists. "Keller was just the face of it. There's a whole disease rotting this place from the inside." His words carried the weight of years spent watching in silence, a guilt he now sought to atone for. Each day, more officers stepped forward, their confessions piling onto Keller's already towering sins. By afternoon, surveillance footage leaked from the jail. Keller, alone in his cell, his head in his hands, sobbing as the walls of his world caved in. The man who'd terrorized so many now trembled under the consequences he'd never imagined. Downtown, the streets pulsed with protesters, their anger giving way to a steely determination. Signs demanding justice for Simon mingled with calls for systemic overhaul. The crowd's energy palpable. Dwayne took the stage, his voice booming over the square like thunder. "What happened to my daughter was a nightmare," he said, his fists clenched at his sides. "But it's exposed something worse: a system that shielded the guilty and silenced the brave. That stops today." The crowd erupted, their cheers a rallying cry for a new dawn. As night settled, Captain Martinez sifted through applications for diversity training, her office a quiet fortress amid the storm. The department would need to be reborn: new policies, new oversight, a new promise to every community. It had failed. Sarah's evidence had sparked 3 more arrests that day, including a senior supervisor who'd buried Keller's crimes for decades. His smug facade finally shattered. In his cell, Keller lay awake, the faces of his victims flickering in the dark, ghosts of his own making. His assault on Simon hadn't just ended his career. It had ignited a reckoning that would echo across the nation. Justice, he realized too late, wasn't a privilege to be twisted, it was a force that leveled all, no matter how high they'd climbed. The next day loomed with more revelations, but for now, Los Angeles slept under a sky tinged with hope, the lessons of power's abuse and justice's triumph sinking deep into its soul. In the sprawling, sunlit expanse of police headquarters, a quiet revolution was unfolding, one that carried the weight of years of buried truths clawing their way to the surface. The air buzzed with tension and the faint hum of anticipation, as newly appointed internal affairs investigators sifted through a dusty, forgotten box brimming with civilian complaints. Each yellowed page a silent scream from the past, dismissed and discarded like so much refuse. These weren't just reports, they were fragments of shattered lives, scrawled pleas from people who'd been ignored, their voices drowned out by a system designed to shield its own. As the investigators pored over them, patterns emerged like ghosts rising from the shadows: abuse, coercion, violencia overlooked because the perpetrators could sprint through obstacle courses or hoist weights at recruitment trials, their red flags fluttering unseen in the wind. Captain Elena Martinez stood at the head of a dimly lit briefing room, her sharp gaze sweeping over the handful of officers still untainted by the sprawling scandal that had erupted like a wildfire across the precinct. Her uniform was crisp, her posture unyielding, but beneath her steely exterior churned a storm of resolve and quiet fury. These were her people, what was left of the man. She felt the sting of betrayal as keenly as the hope of redemption. "No more," she declared, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. "Every complaint gets a full investigation. Every body camera gets reviewed, frame by frame. The days of turning a blind eye to rotten apples are over." Her words weren't just a policy shift. They were a vow, a promise to the city and to herself that justice would no longer be a privilege for the powerful. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some nodding solemnly, others staring at the floor, the weight of their complicity pressing down like a physical force. Across town, in a cramped downtown law office cluttered with stacks of legal pads and steaming coffee cups, Officer Daniel Rodriguez hunched over a table with a group of reform advocates. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his tired face, but his eyes burned with purpose. Once a rookie under the thumb of the infamous Officer James Keller, Rodriguez had seen the corruption up close, felt its cold grip when Keller's sneering lessons about the invincibility of the badge sank into his bones. Now he channeled that bitter memory into something constructive, his voice steady as he spoke to the group. "It's not just about race, though that's part of it. It's about power, raw, unchecked power. Keller didn't just break rules, he taught us the badge was a shield, a free pass to do whatever we wanted." His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through training manuals, scribbling notes for new programs that would emphasize accountability over arrogance. The advocates listened intently, a mix of lawyers and community organizers whose own scars from police encounters fueled their quiet determination. By mid-afternoon, the city was rocked by another seismic revelation. Sarah Keller, James's wife, sat in a sterile interrogation room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she faced a team of investigators. Her blonde hair was disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights and the crushing guilt of complicity. She'd been cooperating for days, but this was different. Her voice quavered as she revealed a secret she'd stumbled upon: a storage unit, rented under her husband's name, hidden away in a gritty industrial corner of Los Angeles. Inside, investigators found a treasure trove of damning evidence boxes stuffed with files chronicling years of illegal dealings, not just Keller's, but a sprawling web of officers across precincts. Sarah's breath hitched as she described the moment she'd unlocked the unit, the stale air thick with the stench of betrayal. "I didn't know how deep it went," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I thought it was just him." Dwayne Johnson, the towering figure known to the world as The Rock, received the news in a wood-paneled meeting room at the state capitol, surrounded by legislators in stiff suits. His broad shoulders were hunched, his jaw tight as he absorbed the update from a buzzing phone. The man who'd once wrestled foes in the ring now grappled with a far uglier phytone that struck at the heart of his family. "This isn't just about locking up a few bad cops anymore," he said. His deep voice low and deliberate, each word laced with a father's anguish and a citizen's resolve. It's about tearing down the whole damn culture that let them flourish. The legislators exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tectonic shift his words implied. For Dwayne, it was personal. His daughter, Simon, had been brutalized by Keller's hands, and the memory of her trembling voice recounting the assault fueled his every move. Meanwhile, at the county jail, James Keller sat in a stark holding cell, the clanging of metal doors echoing around him as he faced the unraveling of his empire. The man who'd once strode through Los Angeles like a king, his badge a scepter of fear, now slumped against the cold concrete wall, his arrogance stripped away. Hours of recorded confessions spilled from him like a flood, names, dates, crimes, a litany of corruption that stunned even the seasoned FBI agents listening in. High-ranking officers, politicians, judges, one agent muttered, scribbling furiously. People we didn't even suspect. Keller's voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of his own words crushing what little remained of his defiance. Outside, the evening sky deepened to a bruised purple, and Simon Johnson took the stage at a community meeting in a neighborhood scarred by years of police brutality. Her presence was a beaconsmo but fierce, her dark hair framing a face etched with both pain and strength. The crowd, a sea of weathered faces and tear-streaked cheeks, leaned in as she spoke. "My dad taught me real strength isn't about muscle," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "It's about standing up, even when it costs you everything." Her words hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope weaving through the despair. As night fell, hundreds gathered outside the precinct where Keller had once reigned, their candles flickering like stars against the darkness. Signs bobbed above the crowd, bearing the names of his victims, names once whispered in fear, now shouted in defiance. Inside his cell, Keller watched the vigil unfold on a grainy TV screen, the sound muted but the images deafening. His hands, once steady as they wielded power, now shook as he gripped the edge of his cot. The man who'd thrived on terror was now its prisoner, his legacy a festering wound of shame rather than the glory he'd envisioned. The sixth day of the scandal dawned with a fury that shook the city to its core. Before the sun had fully risen, FBI agents fanned out across Los Angeles, their black SUVs cutting through the morning haze like predators on the hunt. Raids targeted not just cops but judges, city officials, and business tycoon spillers of the community who'd propped up Keller's reign with dirty money and whispered deals. At City Hall, a dramatic scene unfolded as federal agents escorted to senior council members out in handcuffs, their tailored suits wrinkled and their faces pale with shock. Bystanders gawked as hidden camera footage leaked grainy clips of the pair haggling over payoffs. To silence Keller's victims, their voices cold and transactional. Dwayne watched the coverage from his home office, Simon at his side, her small hand resting on his arm. "It goes all the way up," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Bigger than we ever dreamed." At the federal courthouse, prosecutors waded through a deluge of new evidence, their desks buried under files and laptops glowing with offshore account records millions, funneled to gag victims, bribe witnesses, and shield the guilty. Lead investigator Sarah Chen stood before a scrum of reporters, her voice crisp despite the exhaustion tugging at her features. "This isn't just one man's crime," she said, holding up a stack of bank statements. "It's a machine built to protect the corrupt and crush the innocent." Back at the jail, Keller was shuffled into protective custody, his former brothers-in-arms now his enemies. The guards' faces were masks of contempt as they marched him down an echoing corridor. "How's it feel?" one sneered, jabbing a finger at the bars. Being the one locked up, Keller's silence was louder than any answer, his hollow eyes reflecting a man who'd lost everything: power, pride, even the illusion of invincibility. Across town, Benjamin Hayes, a weary ex-cop with graying hair and a voice roughened by years of shouting into the void, sat in a diner booth with a group of fellow whistleblowers. They'd been drummed out of the force for daring to report Keller's brutality, their careers torched while he climbed higher. Now, Benjamin's hands shook as he clutched a chipped mug, tears brimming as he spoke. "They ruined us," he rasped, "called us traitors, took our badges. But now the world knows we were right." His companions nodded, their weathered faces a gallery of vindication, and lingering pain unsung heroes finally stepping into the light. At police headquarters, the reform task force was in full swing. Captain Martinez and Officer Rodriguez at the helm. The bullpen hummed with activity officers testing new body cameras that couldn't be switched off. Paperwork piling up as every old complaint was reopened. Martinez's voice rang out over the chaos. The old ways are dead. Adapt or leave. Her tone brooked no argument, her eyes daring anyone to challenge her. Meanwhile, Simon testified before a state senate committee, her voice trembling but unbroken as she recounted her assault. I had a famous dad and resources, she said, tears streaking her cheeks. What about the others who didn't? Who fights for them? The senators shifted in their seats. Some moved to tears, others shamed into silence by her raw honesty. Dwayne, meanwhile, met with police academy brass, his presence filling the room as he pushed for training rooted in de-escalation and service, not dominance. We're not tweaking policies, he growled, his fists clenched. We're rewriting what it means to wear that badge. Late that afternoon, Sarah Keller dropped her final bombshell, a tape of her husband and top officials plotting to take out the trash, their term for good cops who dared to speak up. Her hands shook as she handed it over, her voice barely a whisper. They didn't just protect him, they fed the beast. By evening, downtown Los Angeles pulsed with the energy of a massive rally, thousands strong cops, ex-cops, citizens all united for reform. Dwayne's voice boomed over the crowd, a father's rage and a leader's hope intertwined. This isn't vengeance. It's about making damn sure no parent watches their kid suffer at the hands of those meant to protect. In a hospital room, one of Keller's victims, a young woman with a bandaged arm and a fragile smile, watched the broadcast. If they can take him down, she murmured to her nurse, maybe justice isn't a myth. The day closed with more arrests. 3 judges hauled off for burying cases, their robes traded for cuffs. In his cell, Keller scribbled furiously, pages of confessions stacking up like a monument to his downfall. Outside, a vigil glowed with candlelight, the anger of past nights giving way to a tentative hope. The system that had cradled corruption was fracturing, and from its ruins, something stronger, fairer, might yet emerge. A month later, the federal courthouse was a crucible of reckoning. Judge Maria Rodriguez, her silver hair gleaming under the lights, faced a packed gallery as she prepared to sentence James Keller. The man who'd once ruled the streets sat diminished, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the swagger of his past. Victims and families filled the seats, Dwayne and Simon among them, their hands clasped tightly. In 30 years, Judge Rodriguez began, her voice a steady thunder. I've never witnessed such a betrayal of trust. The room held its breath as she delivered the verdict, 30 years, no parole. But she pressed on, her gaze sweeping the crowd. This isn't just one man's sin. It's a system that nurtured him. I'm ordering federal oversight of the LAPD for 5 years. Outside, the verdict sparked cheers, signs proclaiming justice served dancing in the sunlight. At headquarters, Deputy Chief Martinez oversaw a precinct reborn, new policies, new purpose, a fragile promise of change. The lesson was clear. Power unchecked breeds monsters, but justice, relentless and unflinching, can topple even the mightiest thrones. Los Angeles exhaled, daring to believe in a future where the badge meant protection, not predation. The morning sun spilled through the slatted blinds of the Riverside Police Department, casting golden stripes across Chief Sarah Thompson's office. At 45, she stood before her mirror, adjusting the crisp lines of her uniform with deliberate care. The golden badge pinned to her chest glinted in the light, a quiet testament to the history she'd forged 6 months earlier as the first black woman to helm this department. Her dark hair was swept back into a tight, professional bun, and her brown eye sharp, unyielding skinned her reflection. 2 decades of police work had honed her senses to a razor's edge. She could hear the faint creak of her office door settling into its frame, catch the murmured voices that trailed her through the station's corridors. Some of those whispers swelled with pride, others simmered with resentment. But Sarah had long since trained herself to let them roll off her like rain on glass. Her focus was unshakable. Glancing at the clock on her wall, She drifted back to a memory from 20 years prior, a nervous young woman, stepping into the police academy, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and determination. She'd been one of only 3 women in her class, the sole black face in a sea of skepticism. "You won't last," they'd told her, voices dripping with doubt. But Sarah had silenced them all, graduating at the top of her cohort. The road from rookie to chief had been a grueling climb, paved with late-night shifts, brutal cases, and relentless study. Each promotion had brought fresh battlesome officers saluted her grit, while others dissected her every move with quiet disdain. Now, as she strode through the station, the greetings she received were a mixed chorus. Officer Rodriguez flashed a wide, admiring grin. Proud to serve under a trailblazer, Sergeant Miller offered a respectful nod, their years of collaboration etched into his steady gaze. But Officer Barrett barely lifted his eyes, his silence louder than words. In her first 6 months as chief, Sarah had wasted no time shaking the dust off old ways. She'd rolled out training programs crafted with input from community leaders and civil rights advocate sessions designed to bridge the gap between the badge and the people it served. Complaints against officers, once shoved into drawers to gather cobwebs, now landed on her desk for real scrutiny. She'd pushed to diversify the force, recruiting women and people of color, until the department began to mirror the city it swore to protect. Not everyone cheered her efforts. Just the day before, she'd overheard Barrett in the break room, his voice low and bitter. Things were better before all this. Sarah knew exactly what he meant. Better for some, maybe, but not for the countless faces the old system had failed. At her desk, she opened a thick folder brimming with last week's reports, her coffee steaming beside her. Crime stats, response times, community feedback. Her secretary had organized it all with precision. Yellow sticky notes flagging the critical points. A knock broke her focus. "Come in," she called, looking up as Captain Rodriguez stepped inside, a fresh stack of papers in hand. "Morning, Chief," he said, setting the report down with a faint smile. "That outreach program you kicked off, it's working. Complaints are down 15% since last month." A flicker of satisfaction warmed Sarah's chest. This was the spark she'd been chasing. "Good to hear, Captain. Any hurdles?" Rodriguez hesitated, then admitted, "Some of the veterans are still grumbling about the sensitivity training." Barrett's been the loudest. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "Change doesn't happen overnight. We'll keep pushing, one step at a time." After he left, she rose and crossed to her window, gazing out at Riverside's shifting skyline, old factories morphing into community hubs, new shops breathing life into forgotten corners. The city wasn't perfect, but it was hers to safeguard. Across town, another scene unfolded under the weight of a different legacy. Twain Johnson stood on the courthouse steps, the midday sun beating down on his broad shoulders as he faced a throng of reporters. Beside him stood his daughter, Simone, her presence a quiet fire that burned through the crowd's murmurs. "This verdict isn't just about punishment," Twain declared, his voice deep and steady, carrying over the restless shuffle of feet and clicking cameras. "It's about transformation. It's about making damn sure what happened to my girl never touches another parent's child." His words trembled with a father's grief, hardened by resolve. The investigation he'd fought for had torn through decades of rot, dragging 43 officers, 6 judges, and 12 city officials into the light. A corrupt web that had shielded rogue cops for generations lay in ruins, and Twain felt the bittersweet sting of victory. Simone, though, wasn't content to be just a symbol. Her dark eyes blazed as she stepped forward, announcing the Johnson Justice Initiative Foundation, born from her pain, dedicated to lifting up victims of police brutality and hammering reform into law enforcement's bones. "We're not stopping here," she vowed, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Not just in Los Angeles, every city, every department that's festering with the same sickness. We'll be there." Her resolve was a living thing, pulsing with the memory of the violence that had nearly broken her and the strength that had pulled her through. Inside the precinct, Officer Rodriguez, no head of internal affairs, sat at a desk cluttered with files, his jaw set with purpose. He'd testified against his former partner, a man he'd once called a brother, and the betrayal still gnawed at him late at night. but he'd made his choice, and now he was rewriting the rules. His first move had been an anonymous reporting system, a lifeline for officers brave enough to call out rot without fear of reprisal. The blue wall's done, he told his team, his tone firm as he met their ice zone by one. From here on, good cops shield the good, and the bad ones answer to justice. His words hung heavy, a promise and a warning. Meanwhile, Sarah Keller wrestled with her own ghosts. Once married to Officer Kellerth man, whose brutality had sparked this reckoning, shed turned whistleblower, exposing his crimes with a trembling hand and a breaking heart. Now, she worked alongside reform advocates, her insider knowledge a scalpel slicing through corruption's warning signs in departments far beyond Los Angeles. Every meeting left her drained, her mind replaying the years she'd spent blind to his darkness. But she pressed on, driven by a need to atone. In his prison cell, Officer Keller hunched over a battered notebook, his pen scratching out a confession that spilled across page after page. Each word was a wound reopen at every abuse of power, every racist snarl, every choice that had led him to this concrete cage. His hands shook as he wrote, the weight of his fall pressing down on his shoulders. That manuscript would later find its way into training rooms, a grim lesson for rookie officers on the man they must never become. The day closed with a ceremony at City Hall, the air thick with anticipation. The mayor's pen scratched across the Simone Johnson Act, the city's most sweeping police reform package, yet mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight, harsh penalties for abusers of power. Dwayne Johnson watched, his arm draped round Simone, pride swelling in his chest. What had begun with an act of violence had bloomed into a movement, a testament that even the darkest nights could birth dawn. Sometimes the biggest shifts come from the ugliest moments, he told the crowd, his voice steady as stone. Today, we've shown justice outmuscles corruption. That truth cuts deeper than fear. As the sun dipped below Los Angeles jagged horizon, police stations buzzed with the first ripples of change. Officers filed into training rooms, their notebooks opened to lessons on de-escalation and cultural respect. The tale of Keller and Simone became a cornerstone in Academy Hall's stark pivot, where one man's bid to dominate through cruelty unraveled a system and birthed a new era. Keller had sought to silence a victim. Instead, he'd amplified a chorus of thousands. His power, once a weapon, had turned against him, toppling the very shield he'd hid behind. Night settled over the city, and the badge began to shift in meaning, no longer a cloak for brutality, but a vow of service to all. Dwayne's words echoed in the quiet. He'd crushed Keller not with fists, but with the slow, unrelenting force of justice. And as Riverside streets hummed with cautious hope, Chief Sarah Thompson prepared for her next meeting, her badge gleaming, her resolve unbroken. The fight was far from over, but she'd never been one to flinch. In the dim glow of the Riverside Police Department's conference room, a towering figure loomed in the back row. Officer James Barrett was an imposing man, his graying hair swept back carelessly, framing a face dominated by icy blue eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone who dared meet his gaze. His uniform, despite his chaotic demeanor, was always pristine, crisp lines and polished buttons standing in stark contrast to the storm brewing within him. Around him, a handful of fellow officers fidgeted in their seats, their shoulders tense, eyes darting nervously. They knew Barrett too well. His reputation as a troublemaker preceded him like a dark cloud, casting unease wherever he went. Across the room, Chief Sarah Thompson stood at the podium, her posture unwavering, her voice slicing through the morning stillness with crystalline clarity. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her tone professional yet warm, carrying the weight of someone who had fought long and hard to earn her place. "Today, we're diving into some new programs designed to strengthen our connection with the community we serve." With a steady hand, she clicked to the first slide of her presentation, a cascade of numbers and charts illuminating the screen, statistics detailing police interactions across racial and socioeconomic lines. She spoke with purpose, her words measured, her focus unshaken, even as she felt the undercurrent of tension rippling through the room. Then came the scoff, loud, sharp, and deliberate. It erupted from Barrett, reverberating off the walls like a gunshot. Sarah pressed on, undeterred, outlining the initiatives with the same calm resolve she'd honed over 2 decades in law enforcement. But she couldn't ignore the way Barrett leaned toward the officers beside him, his whispers slithering through the air like a venomous hiss. The men next to him shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flickering between their disruptive colleague and the chief, caught in the crossfire of his defiance. As Sarah detailed the new training recommencement sessions on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation, a harsh scrape cut through her explanation. Barrett's chair grated against the linoleum floor as he lurched to his feet, his broad frame casting a shadow over the room. "This is ridiculous," he bellowed, his voice slicing through her sentence like a blade. "We don't need more of this touchy-feely nonsense. We need real police work." The room fell into a suffocating silence, every head swiveling between the towering officer and the composed woman at the front. The air thickened with anticipation, a collective breath held as they awaited her response. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest, but her face betrayed nothing. She'd faced men like Barrett before, officers who bristled at change, who saw her very presence as a threat to their fragile egos. Drawing on years of experience, she straightened her shoulders and met his glare. "Officer Barrett," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the storm, "if you have concerns, we can address them after the meeting in a professional manner. For now, please take your seat." Her words were polite but edged with steel, a quiet command that brooked no argument. But Barrett was a man unaccustomed to restraint. His face flushed a deep crimson, veins pulsing at his temples as he took a step forward. "No, we need to talk about this now," he snapped, his tone dripping with defiance. "You've been here 6 months, and you're tearing apart everything that works just because you're." He stopped abruptly, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air, a silent accusation that everyone understood. The room bristled with unease, the weight of his implication sinking into every corner. Sarah's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. "Because I'm what, Officer Barrett?" she pressed, her voice still calm, but now laced with an unmistakable challenge. "Please, finish your thought." Inside, she felt the familiar sting of such encounters, exhaustion of proving herself again and again. But she refused to let it show. She stood tall, a pillar of authority amidst his chaos. The other officers squirmed in their seats, the tension palpable. Sergeant Miller, a grizzled veteran with a salt and pepper beard and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. "James, sit down. You're out of line." His words carried the weight of years spent navigating the department's rough waters alongside Sarah, a quiet testament to their shared history. But Barrett ignored him, his fury unchecked. "You're not qualified for this job," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "Everyone knows you only got here because of what you are, not who you are." A collective gasp rippled through the room, shock mingling with discomfort. Captain Rodriguez, a weary man with sharp features and a keen sense of loyalty, half froze from his chair, his hand twitching toward his radio. But Sarah raised a subtle hand, signaling him to hold back. She could feel the eyes of every officer on her, waiting to see how she'd navigate this minefield. "Officer Barrett," she said, her voice now resonating with the full force of her rank, "this meeting is about improving how we protect and serve everyone in our community. If you can't contribute professionally, you're dismissed." "You can't dismiss me," Barrett roared, his fists balling at his sides, his chest heaving with indignation. "I've been here 15 years. I've earned my place." His words echoed with a bitter pride, a man clinging to a past he refused to let go. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unshaken. "And I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, Officer Barrett," she replied evenly. "I've earned my place every step of the way. Now, for the last time, sit down or leave." The room felt like a pressure cooker, the air so thick it seemed to hum with electricity. Several officers hovered near their phones, fingers itching to record the escalating drama. Barrett stood frozen, his breath ragged, his face a mask of fury. Then, with a sudden jerk, he turned and stormed toward the door, his heavy boots pounding the floor. In his wake, his chair toppled with a crash, a symbolic echo of his unraveling composure. As he reached the threshold, he spun back, his voice a guttural growl. "This isn't over." The promise lingered like a dark omen as he disappeared into the hallway. Sarah waited until the door slammed shut, then exhaled slowly, her fingers adjusting the papers on the podium with deliberate care. "Now," she said, her voice reclaiming its steady rhythm, "let's continue. Our new community engagement initiatives will focus on building trust and understanding." The meeting resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Whispers fluttered among the officers, some nodded in quiet support of her vision. Others cast anxious glances toward the door, wondering what Barrett's next move would be. A line had been drawn, and he had chosen his side. Unbeknownst to them, Barrett hadn't gone far. He lingered in the hallway, his broad shoulders slumped against the wall, his anger simmering like a fire stoked by every passing second. His mind raced with resentment, each thought a jagged edge sharpening his resolve. The department meeting ticked on, ending precisely at 10:30 a.m. Officers trickled out of the conference room, their footsteps muted against the linoleum. Their conversations hushed. Sarah remained behind, gathering her materials with meticulous precision. She'd felt the room's tension spike after Barrett's outburst, and wanted to give her team space to disperse before she faced whatever awaited her beyond the door. Captain Rodriguez approached, his brow furrowed with concern. "Chief, want me to walk you to your office?" Barrett didn't look stable when he stormed out. His voice was low, laced with the protective instinct of a man who'd seen too many conflicts spiral out of control. Sarah offered him a small, reassuring smile, though her mind churned with calculations. "Thank you, Captain, but I've handled officers like him before. I'll be fine." She tucked her laptop under her arm, smoothed her uniform, and stepped into the hallway. The corridor stretched before her, unnaturally quiet for a bustling police station. The usual clamor of ringing phones and overlapping voices had dulled to a murmur, as if the building itself held its breath. As Sarah rounded the corner toward her office, she spotted Himbrett, leaning against the wall, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was still flushed, his fists clenched, his presence a coiled spring ready to snap. Security cameras blinked their red lights from either end of the hall, silent witnesses to the brewing storm. A few officers lingered nearby, pretending to check their phones or shuffle paperwork, their eyes darting toward the confrontation with thinly veiled curiosity. Sarah could have taken another route, slipped away through a side exit, but retreat wasn't in her nature. She walked forward, her steps deliberate, her chin lifted. Barrett pushed off the wall as she neared, his bulk blocking her path. "You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone?" he growled, his voice low and menacing, vibrating with barely contained rage. Sarah stopped a few feet away, maintaining a professional distance, though her pulse quickened. "Officer Barrett," she said, her tone as steady as ever, "I suggest you take some time to cool off. We can discuss your concerns through proper channels when you're ready to talk like an adult." "Like an adult?" Barrett's voice rose, each word a hammer striking stone. "You want to talk about professionalism? You've been ruining this department since the day you walked in." He took a step closer, his finger jabbing toward her face, his breath hot with fury. Two younger officers, rookies with wide eyes and nervous hands, shifted forward, ready to intervene. But Sarah raised a hand, halting them. She knew the stakes. One misstep, and this could explode beyond repair. "Every change you've made is about race or diversity," Barrett continued, his voice booming down the hall. "What about real police work? What about the way things used to be?" His words were a desperate grasp at a fading era, a time he romanticized despite its flaws. Sarah met his gaze, her dark eyes steady against his wildfire. "The way things used to be didn't work for everyone, Officer Barrett," she said, her voice firm but measured. "Our job is to protect and serve the entire community, not just the parts you're comfortable with." "Community." He spat the word like it burned his tongue. "You don't know this community. I was patrolling these streets while you were still a kid in school." More officers gathered now, drawn by the shouting. Sergeant Miller appeared at the far end of the hall, his radio crackling as he murmured into it, likely summoning backup. The cameras watched on, their lenses unblinking. Sarah tilted her head, her expression unshaken. "You're right, he was in school, studying criminal justice, learning how to serve my community better. And I've spent 20 years putting that knowledge into action, earning every rank through sweat and determination." Her words were a quiet rebuke, a reminder of her own journey, a path Barrett couldn't diminish, no matter how loudly he raged. His face twisted, rage contorting his features into something feral. "Don't lecture me about dedication," he snarled. "You got this job because you're—" He stopped, teetering on the edge of a line he couldn't uncross. Sarah's voice cut through, sharp and precise. "Choose your next words carefully, Officer Barrett. You're already facing discipline for your outburst in the meeting. Don't dig yourself deeper." The hallway fell silent, the weight of her warning hanging heavy. Barrett stepped closer, invading her space, his breath ragged, sweat glistening on his brow. "You think you can threaten me?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think your title makes you better than me? I've got friends in this department, friends in the union. You can't touch me." His words were a taunt, a challenge born of desperation. Sarah stood her ground, her posture unyielding. "Step back, Officer Barrett. This is your final warning." But he didn't retreat. Instead, he leaned in, his face inches from hers, his voice a venomous murmur. "You don't belong here, you never will, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." The hallway seemed to shrink, the tension a living thing pressing against them. Time slowed, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the cameras recording every second. In that moment, Barrett's defiance wasn't just a personal attack, it was a rejection of justice itself. A man drunk on the power he'd wielded unchecked for years. Sarah, unwavering, embodied the counterpoint, a leader who understood that true authority came from integrity, not intimidation. The consequences of Barrett's actions loomed large, a lesson in the making that abusing power, whether through prejudice or pride, inevitably led to its own downfall. The hallway held its breath, poised on the edge of a reckoning no one could fully predict. In the dimly lit hallway of the Riverside Police Department, tension hung thick in the air, palpable as the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Officer Sarah Thompson, newly appointed Chief of Police, stood with her feet planted firmly on the scuffed linoleum floor, her years of rigorous training whispering in her mind to stay vigilant, to anticipate the unexpected. She noticed the subtle signs, immediate telefiker James Barrett's right hand twitching uncontrollably, a nervous tick betraying his inner turmoil, and his broad shoulders hunching upward, muscles tightening like coiled springs ready to snap. Around them, a small crowd of fellow officers lingered, their eyes wide with unease, fingers fumbling toward their pockets to pull out phones, ready to capture whatever storm was brewing. Sarah's voice cut through the charged silence, steady and resolute, carrying the weight of her authority. "I said step back, Officer Barrett," she repeated, her tone unwavering, a beacon of calm amid the rising chaos. Her hands rested openly at her sides, palms visibly deliberate gesture of composure, a silent refusal to escalate the danger pulsing through the corridor. She could feel the heat of the moment pressing against her, but her face remained a mask of professionalism, her dark eyes sharp and unyielding. Barrett's gaze darted wildly, scanning the hallway, taking in the growing number of witness escalages he'd once shared coffee with, laughed with, now staring at him with a mix of dread and disbelief, his lips curled into a sneer, ugly and jagged, as if he could shield himself with contempt. Or what? He spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll add me to your little list of problem officers? You think you can waltz in here with that shiny badge and turn everything upside down?" His words were a challenge, a desperate grasp at the power he felt slipping through his fingers. Sarah didn't flinch. "This isn't about change anymore, Barrett," she replied, her voice as cool and measured as a winter stream. "This is about your refusal to obey a direct order from a superior officer." Her words landed like stones, heavy with truth, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something flicker in his ice anger. Yes, but also a crack, a fracture in his bravado. Then it happened. Something broke inside Barrett, a dam giving way under the weight of his festering resentment. Witnesses would later recall that moment with chilling clarity. The way his face twisted into a mask of raw, unfiltered hatred, his eyes narrowing to slits, his breath quickening. Before anyone could move, before a single shout could pierce the air, his right hand whipped upward in a blur of motion. With every ounce of his pent-up fury, he struck Chief Thompson across the face, a sharp, resounding slap that reverberated through the hallway like the crack of a gunshot. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, Someone cried out, "No," in a voice thick with horror. The force of the blow snapped Sarah's head to the side, a few strands of her meticulously styled hair slipping free, fluttering like dark ribbons against her cheek. For an agonizing heartbeat, silence swallowed the scene. Barrett stood frozen, his hands still raised, trembling in the air as if he couldn't quite grasp the reality of his own actions. Shock bloomed across his features, wide-eyed and disbelieving, as though he'd expected his badge to cloak him in invincibility, to shield him from the consequences of assaulting the chief of police. Around him, the other officers stood rooted to the spot, phones trembling in their hands, capturing every second of the unraveling disaster. Sarah moved slowly, deliberately, turning her head back to face him. Her cheek burned where his hand had landed, the skin prickling with heat that promised a bruise. But her expression remained unshaken. No stumble, no recoil, no flicker of fear, just a steely resolve settling over her like armor. Barrett, still caught in his own stunned paralysis, watched as her gaze locked onto his, piercing and unflinching. His hand lingered in the air, a guilty monument to his mistake, and she could see the dawning terror in his eyes as the weight of his actions began to crush him. It didn't mean he stammered, his voice fracturing, the bravado of moments ago dissolving into a thin, quivering thread of panic. His eyes flicked toward the exits, searching for an escape, but both ends of the hallway were barricaded by officers, some with hands hovering near their radios, others with jaws clenched in disgust. Sarah reached up, her fingers brushing the tender spot on her cheek. Feeling the warmth radiating from the strike, she didn't wince, didn't falter. Instead, she squared her shoulders, her posture radiating authority, and fixed Barrett with a look that made him shrink back a step. The air grew heavier as the other officers watched, breathless, their phones still recording the scene unfolding before them. Sergeant Miller, a grizzled veteran with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual frown, stood near the wall, his hand resting on his radio, his thumb itching to call for backup. Captain Rodriguez, a weary man with sharp eyes and a quick temper, edged closer, his body tense, ready to lunge if Barrett made another move. The hallway felt like a pressure cooker, every second stretching into eternity. Barrett's confidence crumbled further, his sneer replaced by a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. He glanced around, seeking allies among the faces of his peers, but found only revulsion and disappointment staring back at him. "You pushed me to this," he blurted, his voice weak, a pitiful attempt to shift the blame. "You kept pushing and pushing with all these changes." The words sounded hollow, even to him, a flimsy shield against the tide of his own guilt. Sarah stood motionless, her eyes never leaving his. When she spoke again, her voice rang out, clear and commanding, slicing through the tension like a blade. "Officer James Barrett." He flinched at the sound of his full name, an involuntary reflex honed by years of training, his spine straightening despite the chaos swirling within him. The security cameras whirred silently overhead, their unblinking lenses preserving every moment as she continued. "You are under arrest for assaulting a police officer." Her words landed with precision, each syllable a hammer striking nails into the coffin of Barrett's career. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and ghostly, his mouth gaping as though he wanted to protest but couldn't find the air. This wasn't how he'd pictured it. Sarah crumbling, retreating, proving his twisted belief that she didn't belong. Instead, she stood tall, her authority unshaken, her response a masterclass in composure. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," she ordered, her voice carrying the full force of her rank. Barrett didn't move, still trapped in his own disbelief, so she repeated herself, her tone firmer, edged with steel. "I said turn around, Officer Barrett. Don't make this worse than it already is." Captain Rodriguez and Sergeant Miller sprang into action, their movements swift and practiced. Barrett's eyes darted between them, then back to Sarah, his hands trembling as he raised them in surrender. "Yo, you can't do this," he stuttered, but the fight had drained from him, leaving only a shadow of the man who'd stood so defiantly moments before. "I'm a decorated officer. I have rights." "Yes, you do," Sarah replied, her voice calm as she touched her cheek again, the skin now throbbing beneath her fingertips. "And I'll ensure they're read to you, just like any other person who assaults an officer." She nodded to her subordinates. "Take him into custody." Rodriguez and Miller closed in, their hands steady as they gripped Barrett's arms. His legs buckled slightly, the bravado stripped away, revealing a man diminished by his own choices. "Captain Rodriguez, please read Officer Barrett his rights," Sarah instructed, her composure a lighthouse in the storm. Around them, the other officers watched in stunned silence, some still filming, their phones trembling slightly as the gravity of the moment sank in. "You have the right to remain silent," Rodriguez began, his voice a low, steady rumble as he snapped the handcuffs around Barrett's wrists. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words echoed down the hall, a ritualistic chant sealing Barrett's fate. Sarah turned to the gathered officers, her presence commanding their attention. "I want statements from everyone who witnessed this. Officer Chen, retrieve the security footage immediately. Officer Williams, contact Internal Affairs. This will be handled by the book." With complete transparency, the hallway erupted into motion, officers shaking off their shock to carry out her orders. Some hurried to their desks to draft statements, others cordoned off the area, their footsteps a staccato rhythm against the floor. Barrett stood against the wall, handcuffed, his head bowed as the full weight of his actions crashed over him like a tidal wave. Sergeant Miller approached Sarah, his brow furrowed with concern. "Chief, Mum, would you like to go to the hospital? Get that injury documented?" She touched her cheek again, noting the swelling, the heat pulsing beneath her skin. "Yes, we'll do that," she said, her voice steady. "But first, I want to ensure everything here is handled properly." She turned to Barrett, who couldn't meet her eyes, his defiance reduced to a flicker of shame. "Officer Barrett, you'll be processed like any other suspect. Captain Rodriguez will escort you to booking." As Rodriguez led him away, Barrett's voice broke through the haze, shaky and desperate. "My union reepy want my union representative." Sarah's response was immediate, professional. "You'll have the opportunity to contact them. Every step of this process will be by the book. You'll receive the same rights and treatment as anyone else in Custodino, more, no less." His shoulders slumped as he disappeared around the corner, the other officers parting like a sea, their heads shaking in disbelief. In mere minutes, Barrett had torched 15 years of service, all because he couldn't stomach taking orders from a black woman. Sarah watched him go, then turned to address the remaining officers, her voice firm despite the red mark blooming on her face. "I know this is a hard moment for our department, but this is why we need the changes we discussed today. What happened here isn't just one officer losing control, it's the culture that made him think he could act without consequence." The officers listened, rapt, some nodding as her words sank in. In that moment, they saw not just their chief, but a leader transforming a moment of violence into a lesson on justice and accountability. News of Barrett's arrest spread through the department like wildfire, whispers racing from the third-floor hallway to every corner of the building. By afternoon, the security footage was secured, statements were piling up, and Internal Affairs was on the case. Sarah sat in her office, an ice pack pressed to her cheek, speaking with investigators as the bruise darkened a stark reminder of the morning's chaos. Her phone buzzed incessantly on her desk, messages flooding in from city officials, fellow chiefs, and reporters, but her focus remained unshaken. Barrett's downfall was more than a personal failure, it was a mirror held up to the department, reflecting the rot of unchecked power and prejudice. For Sarah, it was a painful but powerful affirmation. Justice wasn't just a word, but a force, one she'd wield with unwavering resolve. And as the officers of Riverside processed the day's events, they knew they'd witnessed a reckoning that would echo far beyond that hallway, a testament to the cost of abusing authority and the strength of those who stand against it. In the dimly lit office of Chief Sarah Thompson, the air was thick with tension as Lieutenant Garcia from Internal Affairs sat poised with her pen hovering over a fresh notepad. Her sharp eyes flicked toward Sarah, her voice steady but insistent. "Take us through it one more time, Chief. We need every detail locked down crystal clear before we move forward." Sarah's lips parted to respond, her mind still reeling from the chaos of the past few hours. When a firm knock rattled the door, she straightened in her chair, brushing a strand of dark hair from her bruised cheek, and called out, "Come in." Officer Chen stepped inside, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, in his hand. He clutched a small USB drive, its metallic surface catching the faint glow of the desk lamp. "Chief, I've got the security footage ready," he said, his tone heavy with the weight of what he'd seen. "All camera angles, clear audio, it's damning stuff." His usually calm demeanor faltered for a moment, his dark eyes meeting Sarah's with a mix of respect and unease. She nodded, her expression unreadable but resolute. "Thank you, Officer Chen. Please make 3 copies, 1 for internal affairs, 1 for the prosecutor's office, and 1 for our records." As Chen turned to leave, his boots scuffing softly against the worn carpet, Sarah shifted her attention back to Garcia, who tapped her pen impatiently. "Now, where were we?" Meanwhile, a different scene unfolded downstairs in the department's break room, where the hum of conversation buzzed like a restless hive. A cluster of officers crowded around Officer Rodriguez, who had just returned from processing the arrest of James Barretta Name, now infamous within these walls. Rodriguez slumped into a chair, his coffee cup trembling slightly in his grip as he exhaled a long, weary breath. Officer Williams, her youthful face creased with disbelief, shook her head vigorously. "I still can't wrap my mind around it. He actually hit her." What was going through his head? Rodriguez stared into the swirling black of his coffee, his voice low and bitter. "That's just I wasn't thinking. 50 years on the force, and he torched it all in one dumb, reckless second." The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in, until Officer Miller, a weary man with a perpetually furrowed brow, broke the silence. He'd been leaning against the counter, arms crossed, his silence a brooding presence until now. "You know what eats at me?" he said, his voice rough with guilt. "All those times we saw him step out of Linusnide remarks, the way he treated people, especially anyone who wasn't like Hyman, we just let it slide." His eyes darted around the room, meeting the uncomfortable gazes of his colleagues. They shifted in their seats, memories flickering behind their ice moments they'd witnessed Barrett's arrogance, his casual cruelty, and chosen to look away. The shame hung heavy, a shared burden they could no longer ignore. Officer Jones, a grizzled veteran with 20 years under his belt, slammed his fist on the table, the sound jolting everyone upright. "Well, that ends today," he declared, his voice booming with a conviction that seemed to shake the fluorescent lights above. "Chief Thompson's been hammering this into us from day one. We've got to hold each other accountable. No more excuses." His weathered face was set in stone, his eyes blazing with a fire that dared anyone to argue. The others nodded slowly, the seed of change taking root in their uneasy hearts. Upstairs, in the detective division, Sarah sat alone at her desk, the faint hum of the precinct fading into the background as she pored over Barrett's personnel file. Each page she turned revealed a darker truth: complaints of aggression, particularly toward minorities and women, scrawled in hurried handwriting or typed in cold, clinical reports. Most had been dismissed with a scribbled note or buried beneath layers of bureaucratic red tape. Her stomach churned as she traced the pattern, years of ignored warnings stretching back like a trail of breadcrumbs. She wished she'd followed sooner. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed Chief Thompson herself. In a moment of surreal self-reflection, "Chief," she said into the receiver, her voice steady despite the exhaustion tugging at her. "It's Martinez. You need to see this. Barrett's filight's a mess. There's a clear pattern, and worse, names of other officers who helped sweep it under the rug." On the other end, her own voice replied, weary but firm, "Bring it all to my office, detective. Every complaint, every report, every name. We're cleaning house." Outside, the department's lobby had transformed into a chaotic swirl of activity as reporters swarmed like vultures scenting a fresh kill. The public information officer, a harried man with sweat beading on his forehead, darted between them, offering vague assurances while dodging their shouted questions. Word of Barrett's arrest had leaked, and now news vans lined the street, their cameras trained on the building's entrance like unblinking eyes. Inside her office, Sarah set down the ice pack she'd been pressing to her cheek, the cold numbing the ache but not the resolve burning within her. She rose and crossed to the window, peering through the blinds at the growing media frenzy below. By nightfall, this story would dominate every channel. Every headline a brutal spotlight on her department. It would be a storm to weather, but perhaps, she thought, it was the reckoning they'd needed all along. Her phone buzzed, snapping her from her reverie. A text from Rodriguez glowed on the screen. "Chief, you need to see this. Officers are stepping up not just about Barrett, but other issues too. They want to talk." Sarah read it twice. Her heart caught between a pang of sorrow and a flicker of hope. Barrett's outburst had shattered a dam of silence, and now voices long stifled were rising to the surface. She glanced at her reflection in the window, bruise on her cheek darkening like a storm cloud. But beyond it, a glimmer of something new, a department teetering on the edge of redemption. Sometimes, she mused, it took a fall to force a climb. She typed a reply, set up a meeting. Let's hear them out. Everyone gets a voice now. 2 weeks later, the Riverside Police Department was a hive of transformation. Its foundations shaken but rebuilding stronger. Chief Sarah Thompson sat at the head of the conference to breathe very room, where Barrett had lunged at her, his fists fueled by rage and entitlement. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a faint shadow, but the changes she'd ignited blazed brighter with each passing day. "Let's go over the numbers," she said, her voice cutting through the room's quiet hum as she scanned the faces of the officers around her. These weren't just any officers, they were the newly minted Internal Review Committee, a diverse crew handpicked by their peers to steer the department into uncharted waters. Sergeant Rodriguez freshly promoted stood at the front, his broad frame commanding attention as he clicked through a presentation on the screen. "In the last 2 weeks, we've had 47 reports from officers about past misconduct," he said, his voice steady but tinged with pride. 32 have come forward with statements, things they saw, things they were too scared to report until now. Sarah scribbled notes on her tablet, her pen moving with purpose. The room buzzed with a quiet energy, not the dread of exposure, but the cautious optimism of a fresh start. Officers who'd once hidden behind silence now spoke freely, shielded by a promise of protection. "What about the training programs?" Sarah asked, turning to Officer Chen, who had emerged as a fierce advocate for reform. He straightened in his chair, his youthful face alight with enthusiasm. "Chief, it's been incredible, 98% participation in the voluntary bias training sessions. Officers aren't just showing up, they're asking for more. They want to learn, to be better." Nods rippled around the table, a shared acknowledgement that Barrett's downfall had pried open eyes once stubbornly shut. Even the skeptics, those who'd bristled at change, now sat among its loudest champions. Beyond the conference room, the department bore the marks of renewal. The hallway walls, once a stale gallery of faded photostern white men in outdated uniforms, now burst with color. Posters touting community policing, images of officers laughing with kids, shaking hands with residents. Detective Martinez leaned forward, her sharp eyes glinting as she slid a stack of folders across the table. "We've finished reviewing Barrett's old cases," she said, her voice cutting like a blade. 23 incidents, excessive force, blatant bias, all being reopened. Sarah inhaled deeply, the weight of it pressing against her chest. "And the officers who covered for him?" she asked. Martinez didn't flinch. 3 suspended, pending investigation, 2 resigned. "The message is loud and clear. The old shield for bad behavior, it's gone." The meeting stretched on, alive with ideas. Officer Williams, her voice bright with nervous excitement, pitched a plan called Coffee with Cops, casual meetups in neighborhood diners, where residents could sit with officers, sip coffee, and talk. No agendas, just trust building. Sarah smiled, recalling how such an idea would have been laughed off weeks ago. Now, hands shot up to volunteer. Later, as she roamed the department, Sarah marveled at the shift. The break room, once a den of crude jokes and averted eyes, now echoed with earnest debates about duty and service. In the training room, she paused at the window, watching a young and old. Men and women practice de-escalation moves, their faces set with focus. Her phone buzzed, a text from the mayor. "Community complaints down 40% since changes started. Keep it up, Chief." She smiled faintly, pocketing the device. 3 months later, the Riverside County Courthouse brimmed with onlookers, a sea of murmurs swelling as Chief Sarah Thompson took her seat in the front row. Her uniform was pristine, every crease sharp, but her eyes were fixed on James Barrett. He stood before the judge, a diminished figure in a baggy suit that swallowed his once imposing frame. The trial had laid him bare. Security footage replayed from every angle, his fist crashing into her cheek in crisp, undeniable clarity. Gone was the bluster, the red-faced fury. Now, he was pale, hollowed out, a man staring down the wreckage of his own making. Sarah watched, her breath steady, as the gavel fell. Justice, she thought, not just for her, but for every soul Barrett had trampled over the years. His abuse of power had been a poison, seeping through the department. But its antidote was this: accountability, raw and unflinching. Back at the station, her office desk groaned under a pile of applications of blood, diverse voices drawn by the department's rebirth. She lifted one, reading a line that struck her: "I want to join a force that serves everyone." Riverside's changes prove it's possible. Out her window, the city stretched wide, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt a quiet pride. Barrett's blow had meant to break her. Instead, it had forged a legacy of renewal alone, rooted in the hard-earned lesson that power unchecked breeds ruin, but power wielded justly can heal. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with anticipation, as the judge adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat, her presence commanding every eye in the room. "Will the defendant please rise?" she declared, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. Steady and unyielding, James Barrett dragged himself to his feet, his movements slow and reluctant, as if the weight of the moment pressed down on his already slumped shoulders. His eyes stayed fixed on the polished wood of the table before him, avoiding the piercing gazes of Chief Sarah Thompson and the cluster of officers seated behind Herman, and women who had laid bare his history of misdeeds with trembling voices and resolute stares. Inside, Barrett's chest tightened, a storm of defiance and dread churning beneath his stoic exterior. He'd always seen himself as untouchable, a man above reproach, but now the walls of his self-made fortress were crumbling. The judge's gaze bore into him, unwavering. "James Barrett," she began, her tone measured yet laced with a quiet fury, "this court has found you guilty of assaulting a police officer, a felony offense aggravated by irrefutable evidence of racial and gender bias driving your actions." The room fell into a deeper hush, the kind that seemed to swallow sound itself. In the back, reporters hunched over their notebooks, pens scratching furiously, while camera shutters clicked like the ticking of a clock, capturing the slow unraveling of Barrett's composure. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the table's edge, the wood creaking faintly under the pressure. Beyond the assault, the judge pressed on, her voice rising slightly. "This trial has peeled back the layers of a troubling pattern, a career riddled with misconduct that has not only wounded individuals, but eroded the very foundation of trust the public places in law enforcement." Sarah Thompson sat a few rows back, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mind churned with memories of the countless complaints filed against Barrett over the years, dismissed or buried, of the victims who'd come to her in tears, their voices shaking as they recounted his cruelty, of the officers too scared to challenge him, their silence a heavy burden she'd carried alongside her badge. She watched his hands flex against the table and felt a flicker of something ganger. Yes, but also a weary satisfaction. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the lives he'd scarred, the trust he'd shattered. Around her, the courtroom buzzed with a quiet intensity. A young officer to her left shifted nervously, his fingers tapping against his knee. A seasoned sergeant beside him stared straight ahead, his jaw tight with unspoken relief. The judge shuffled her papers with deliberate care, the rustle of pages amplifying the tension. "This court sentences you to 18 months in prison," she announced, her words landing like hammer strikes, followed by 3 years of supervised release. "You are hereby permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity. Additionally, you will complete 500 hours of community service with organizations dedicated to supporting minority communities." Barrett's head dipped slightly, a fleeting crack in his armor, though he quickly straightened, his face hardening again. As court officers approached, their boots echoing on the hardwood floor, he cast one last glance around the room, not at Sarah, not at his former colleagues, but at the empty space where his power once stood. Then he was gone, escorted out in a clatter of handcuffs and murmurs. Sarah rose from her seat, her movements steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. Relief, resolve, and a fierce determination to see this through. She stepped into the blinding daylight outside, where a swarm of reporters descended like vultures, microphones thrust toward her, cameras flashing in relentless bursts. "Chief Thompson, how do you feel about the verdict?" one shouted, his voice cutting through the clamor. She paused, adjusting her badge with a deliberate touch, feeling its weight against her chest. "Today isn't just about one man or one moment," she said, her voice clear and firm, carrying over the crowd. "It's about drawing a line in the sand. No one stands above the law, especially not those of us who've sworn to protect it." The reporters scribbled her words, their faces a mix of skepticism and awe. But Sarah had already turned her thoughts inward, to the work still ahead. That afternoon, back at the police department, the large conference room buzzed with life. Officers filled every chair, others lining the walls. Their uniforms crisp, but their expressions varied, some weary, some hopeful, all attentive. 3 months ago, this room had been a battleground of division and doubt, the air thick with mistrust after Barrett's assault rocked their ranks. Now, though, there was a shift, a quiet unity threading through the crowd. Sarah stood at the front, her hands steady as she gripped the podium, her eyes sweeping over the faces before her. "Today's verdict sends a message," she began, her voice resonant. "But the real triumph isn't in that courtroom. It's right here, in what we're building together." She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her flared to life with statistics. Complaints against officers down 60%, community trust up 45%, minority candidate applications soaring by 80%, incidents resolved without force climbing 70%. "These numbers aren't just data," she continued, her tone softening but no less forceful. "They're proof of a story of officers stepping in when they see something wrong, of kids who once crossed the street to avoid us now waving hello, of parents stopping by with coffee just to say thanks." She paused, letting the words settle. Officer Rodriguez, a weary man with a quick smile, raised his hand from the third row. "Chief, that basketball program we kicked off last month, 15 more officers signed up to coach." Sarah's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. Rodriguez had been a skeptic once, grumbling about extra duties, but now his eyes shone with pride. "And the mentorship program?" she prompted. Officer Chen, a soft-spoken woman with a steely core, piped up from the back. 32 officers paired with high schoolers. "Chief, we've got a waiting list of kids begging to join." The room hummed with murmurs of approval, a ripple of energy spreading through the officers. As the meeting stretched on, Sarah's mind drifted to the journey that had brought them here. Barrett's attack meant to cow her, to break their spirit. Thought instead ignited a fire. She thought of Officer Patel, who'd once confided in her about Barrett's taunts, his hands shaking as he spoke. Now he sat near the front, chin high, helping lead the mentorship effort. She thought of the teenage girl who'd approached her at a community event last week, shyly asking about a career in law enforcement, her eyes bright with a dream. Barrett's reign had nearly snuffed out. Later, as Sarah prepared to leave her office that evening, she lingered by a new photo on her wall, her officers at a recent outreach event, laughing with kids, chatting with parents, rebuilding what had been lost. Her phone bootsaid a text from the mayor, saw the news about Barrett's sentencing. "But the real headline is your department. You've shown us what leadership truly means." She slipped on her jacket, the fabric cool against her skin, and flicked off the light. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenged budgets to balance, tensions to ease, but they'd face them together, a department forged anew in the crucible of justice. Barrett had clung to a rotting past, wielding power like a club, blind to its consequences. Yet in his fall, he'd unwittingly handed them the tools to craft something better, a future where accountability reigned, where trust wasn't just a word but a living, breathing bond. The lesson was stark and profound. Abuse power, and it will turn on you. Uphold justice, and it will lift you higher than you ever imagined.